In the brisk chill of early 1986, the campus of the University of Missouri was filled with the anxious, excited energy of graduating seniors. Among them walked William, a 22-year-old young man who, on paper, had a perfectly mapped-out future. He was a journalism major, just a few months away from earning his degree from one of the most prestigious journalism schools in the country. A degree from this institution was a golden ticket to a stable career, but William was deeply unhappy. He realized he had absolutely no passion for news reporting, and the thought of spending his life in a traditional newsroom left him feeling empty. His true passion lay in Hollywood movies. Having lived in Missouri his entire life, William considered himself a sheltered kid who had never traveled far from home. To him, the local movie theater was a magical portal. It transported him to exotic lands, introduced him to fascinating characters, and showed him a world far bigger than his Midwestern surroundings. As graduation loomed, William faced a stark truth. If he didn't make a move now, he would spend his life living someone else's dream. Weeks before receiving his degree, he shocked everyone by dropping out of college, packing his bags into a beat-up car, and driving straight to Los Angeles to become an actor. When he arrived in Hollywood, his naive optimism was instantly met with a harsh reality. William quickly discovered that the streets of Los Angeles were overflowing with thousands of young, attractive, and ambitious people who shared his exact dream. The competition was brutal, with hundreds of actors lining up for even the smallest roles. However, his Midwestern work ethic kept him going. He found a talent agent and began auditioning constantly, willing to take any part, whether it was a low-budget horror film or a simple commercial, just to get in front of a camera. Yet, the industry remained indifferent, and he faced rejection after rejection. While he had the mental strength to handle the rejection, he could not escape his financial reality. Los Angeles was expensive, and his savings were rapidly disappearing. Because he needed to keep his daytime hours open for sudden auditions, he could only take side gigs that operated late at night or early in the morning. Since the city's struggling actors had already taken all the decent part-time jobs, William was left with the bottom-of-the-barrel work that nobody else wanted. To survive, he took two incredibly bizarre jobs. During the day, he worked for a fast food restaurant called El Pollo Loco. His job was to wear a massive, suffocatingly hot yellow chicken suit, stand out on the scorching pavement of Sunset Boulevard, and wave at traffic to lure in customers. It was exhausting and humiliating work. When the sun went down, he transitioned to his night job as a limousine driver for a group of exotic dancers who performed at private bachelor parties. He wasn't just a driver. He also had to enter the venues to act as their bodyguard, manage the music as a mobile DJ, and eventually clean up the cash and scattered clothing left behind before driving the exhausted dancers home at dawn. Initially, William accepted this chaotic life as a temporary rite of passage. But as the months dragged on, the struggling artist romanticism faded. The big break wasn't happening, and the low pay forced him to work grueling hours just to survive, leaving him little time to rehearse or rest. Caught in a miserable cycle of exhaustion and constant rejection, he reached a breaking point. William decided to quit the limousine job, keep the chicken suit gig for stability, and give himself one final, concentrated push. If things didn't change soon, he would pack up his car and move back to Missouri. On his final night driving the limousine, William struck up a conversation with one of the dancers. Like him, she was an aspiring actress using stripping to fund her dream. When William explained that he was simply going to as many open auditions as possible, she told him he was doing it wrong. She recommended a highly exclusive, prestigious acting class in the city where top talent scouts frequently went to look for new faces. She urged him to stop just auditioning and start training. Though William initially dismissed the idea, thinking he didn't have time for theory, he looked at his long streak of failures and decided he had nothing to lose. He agreed to attend just one session. A few days later, William walked into the acting studio. The instructor began pairing students up randomly to perform scenes live in front of the class. When William's name was called, he was paired with another young actor. However, the stakes for this particular scene were incredibly high. The other actor had invited major Hollywood talent agents to this specific class to watch him perform, hoping to get signed. William understood that he was only there to play a supporting role and read lines so his classmate could shine. He felt no pressure and was content to just help out. The two actors stepped onto the stage under the spotlight. The other actor delivered his lines exactly as rehearsed. But when it was William's turn to respond, something inside him shifted. All the months of frustration, the humiliation of the chicken suit, the late nights in the limousine, and the pain of 100 rejections broke through his quiet exterior. He didn't just read the script, he completely lived it. William's performance was electric. He delivered his lines with a raw, magnetic vulnerability and an emotional intensity that completely captivated the room. The spotlight instantly shifted. William didn't just support his partner, he completely overshadowed him. He brought a rare, natural charisma to the stage that commanded absolute attention. When the scene ended, the room was dead silent before bursting into thunderous applause. The talent agents ignored the actor they had originally come to see, walked straight up to William, and signed him on the spot. Word quickly spread through Hollywood about the incredibly talented unknown actor from Missouri who had stolen the spotlight in a high-stakes showcase. The momentum was unstoppable. William took off the chicken suit for good and never had to drive a limousine again. He began booking roles left and right, quickly rising from small parts to leading roles in massive global blockbusters. Today, the world no longer calls him William. Instead, he is known globally by his middle name, an international cinema icon, Academy Award winner, and one of the most celebrated movie stars to ever live, Brad Pitt. And the early fragile days of April 1945. The small town of Velp in the German-occupied Netherlands was locked in a state of suspended animation. The air was heavy, with the smell of smoke, damp earth, and the unmistakable, lingering scent of fear. Inside the cramped, shadow-filled basement of a modest brick house belonging to her aunt, a 15-year-old girl named Ada lay curled on a makeshift pile of faded wool blankets. Her stomach did not just rumble, it burned with a deep, gnawing agony that felt as though her body was slowly consuming itself from the inside out. Ada felt a profound, heavy weakness in her limbs, a lethargy so absolute that even shifting her weight across the floor required a monumental effort of will. She was quite literally standing on the precipice of starvation. At 5 feet 6 inches tall, a height that should have belonged to a developing, energetic young woman, Ada's weight had plummeted to a terrifying 88 pounds. Her collarbones protruded like sharp ridges beneath her threadbare clothes, her skin was a translucent, sickly gray, and her eyes were sunken deep into her skull. She could no longer walk. She could no longer stand. When she tried to look at her mother, who sat silently in the dim light nearby, Ada found she could barely summon the strength to articulate basic words. Her voice had degraded to a dry, raspy whisper. To anyone looking at her, the reality was brutally clear. Without a miracle, the young girl was within a few days, perhaps even hours, of dying. The tragedy of the situation was compounded by the fact that she was not alone in her suffering. Surrounding her in the damp basement were her mother, her aunt, and a desperate group of refugees whom her family had bravely taken in. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the dark, their faces hollow, their own bodies wasting away. They watched Etta fade with breaking hearts, yet there was absolutely nothing they could do. There was no secret stash of bread, no hidden sack of potatoes, and no medicine to soothe her failing organs. The entire household, like millions of others across the Netherlands, had run out of food weeks ago. To make this nightmare even more unbearable, the basement was not just a shelter from hunger, it was a prison. Ada, her family, and the refugees had been completely trapped beneath the floorboards for months. Stepping outside into the daylight was not an option. It was an automatic death sentence. Outside, the closing chapters of World War II were raging across the Dutch countryside with apocalyptic fury. The town of Velp had become a chaotic battleground as the retreating Nazi forces clashed with the advancing Allied armies. Day and night, the ground above the basement trembled. Artillery shells screamed through the air, bombs shattered nearby homes into rivers of brick and dust, and the sharp, rhythmic crackle of machine gun fire echoed down the streets. To venture out in search of a stray turnip or a cup of clean water meant risking a stray bullet or being obliterated by falling debris. They were entirely cornered, caught between the invisible specter of starvation inside and the violent inferno outside. It had not always been this way. 5 years earlier, before the darkness of the war completely swallowed her world, the Netherlands had been a place of color and music for Ada. When the Nazi regime first invaded and occupied her homeland in 1940, she had been a vibrant, joyful 11-year-old girl. She was blessed with an abundance of natural grace and possessed a singular burning dream. She wanted to become a professional, world-class ballet dancer. She lived for the stage, spending hours practicing her postures, her leaps, and her turns. Because she was so young when the gray uniformed soldiers first marched into her town, she didn't fully comprehend the geopolitical catastrophe unfolding around her. To a child, the occupation was an uncomfortable nuisance, a shadow that dimmed the lights but hadn't yet destroyed the house. That childhood innocence shattered completely when the reality of Nazi brutality struck her own family. Ada's uncle was a prominent, highly respected Dutch count and an outspoken anti-Nazi activist. He refused to sit idly by while his country was subjugated. Eventually, his underground activities were discovered by the Gestapo. He was arrested, imprisoned, and, without a fair trial, executed by a Nazi firing squad. The murder of her beloved uncle acted as a profound catalyst for Ada. The grief twisted into a fierce, unyielding determination. She looked at the world around her with newly opened eyes and realized that she could not remain a passive bystander while an oppressive regime tore her country apart. Despite her youth, she chose to fight back. Ada threw herself into the dangerous, secretive world of the Dutch resistance. She realized that her training as a ballerina could be used as a weapon against the occupiers. She began performing in covert underground ballet recitals held in darkened basements and hidden rooms across the region. These events, known as blackout performances, were strictly illegal. The audiences sat in absolute silence, never clapping for fear of alerting the German patrols patrolling the streets outside. The money raised from these hushed recitals was funneled directly into the resistance movement to forge documents, buy supplies, and finance underground operations. But Ada did not stop at dancing. Her innocent, youthful appearance made her the perfect courier. She routinely volunteered to smuggle illegal resistance newspapers, tightly folding the forbidden print and hiding it inside her ballet slippers or the linings of her coats. She rode her bicycle across town, navigating past German checkpoints with a calm, smiling demeanor that masked a racing heart. She knew that if a single soldier decided to search her bags, she would be executed on the spot. As the war intensified, her defiance grew. She successfully convinced her mother and aunt to convert their home into a safe house, taking in and concealing Jewish refugees and downed Allied pilots, hiding them beneath the very floorboards where she now lay dying. Every day was a high-stakes game of survival, but it gave Ada an intense sense of purpose. She was no longer just a helpless girl caught in a war, she was a participant, actively striking blows against tyranny. Then came the catastrophic winter of 1944. Following a major Allied airborne operation known as Market Garden, the Dutch railway workers went on strike to cripple the German military's movements. In a fit of cruel retaliation, the Nazi administration completely blocked all food and fuel transports into the western and northern parts of the Netherlands. This triggered what would forever be remembered as the Hunger Winter. Virtually overnight, supply lines died. A nation was cut off from the world. As the temperatures plummeted below freezing, millions of Dutch citizens found themselves without electricity, running water, heat, or food. People resorted to eating tulip bulbs and boiling grass just to trick their stomachs into feeling full. As the months wore on, the humanitarian crisis deepened into a catastrophe. For Ada, the physical toll was devastating. The intense physical exertion of her resistance work, combined with a total lack of nutrition, caused her health to fracture. Her body, already pushed to its absolute limits, began to shut down. The vibrant ballerina who used to leap effortlessly across stages became too weak to carry a newspaper. Her resistance work came to an abrupt, forced end. She could no longer fight. She could no longer aid the refugees. All she could do was retreat into the dark safety of the basement, lie down on the cold floor, and watch her own body waste away to skin and bone. On that particular fateful day in early April 1945, the noise above the basement reached a terrifying crescendo. Ada lay in the dark, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps. The air was thick with dust shaken loose from the ceiling by the constant vibrations of war. The symphony of destruction outside was deafening, the roar of low-flying fighter planes, the sharp thud of anti-aircraft guns, and the wailing of air raid sirens. It felt as though the entire world above them was being ground into dust. In her extreme weakness, feeling the icy pull of death creeping into her fingers, Ada closed her eyes and offered a silent, desperate prayer to God for help, for food, for an end to the madness. The immediate response to her prayer was a terrifying, high-pitched whistling sound that cut through the ambient roar of the battle. It was a sound that everyone in wartime Europe knew and feared. It was the sound of a falling bomb, and it was coming straight for them. Before anyone in the basement could scream, a deafening blast shattered the atmosphere. The impact was monumental. The floor beneath them violently bucked, throwing debris into the air. Concrete cracked, the remaining glass windows upstairs shattered into 1,000,000 lethal shards, and a choking cloud of black smoke and plaster dust enveloped the room. The shockwave tore through Ada's frail body, and within seconds, the world dissolved into total, silent blackness. Sometime later, hours, perhaps even days, for time loses all meaning in the dark, Ada slowly regained consciousness. She coughed weakly, her throat choked with fine white plaster dust. Her ears were ringing with a loud, piercing static. As the dust slowly settled and her vision cleared in the dim light, she looked around, fully expecting to see a scene of carnage. But as she took inventory of the dark space, she witnessed an absolute miracle. Despite the bomb scoring an incredibly close, near-direct hit on the house above, the ancient stone foundations of the basement's structural integrity had somehow held. The heavy wooden beams had groaned and cracked, but they had not collapsed. She looked at her mother, her aunt, and the refugees. They were covered in white dust, bruised and terrified, but they were all alive. Yet, Ada did not feel a rush of relief. Instead, a profound sense of despair washed over her. She knew that surviving the blast was only a temporary reprieve. The house above them was likely ruined. They were still starving, she was still too weak to move, and the German soldiers were likely closing in. She believed this explosion was simply the beginning of the end. However, as she lay there, waiting for the next bomb to fall, she noticed something highly unusual. For months, the background track of her life had been an unbroken wall of noise, guns, engines, screams, and explosions. But right now, as she listened intently, the world was completely devoid of sound. The silence was heavy, profound, and absolute. There were no planes overhead. There were no artillery shells shaking the earth. There was no gunfire echoing down the cobblestone streets. The violent storm that had raged for years had suddenly, inexplicably, vanished. An uneasy, confused quiet fell over the refugees and her family. They exchanged panicked, uncomprehending glances. Was this a trap? Was the enemy waiting outside? Eventually, the agonizing silence pushed them to action. Driven by a desperate need to know what had happened, Ida's mother walked over to her daughter. Gathering her own remaining strength, she carefully lifted Ida's frail 88-pound frame into her arms, cradling her like a child. Together, the small group of survivors slowly walked up the debris-strewn basement stairs and stepped out into the open air for the first time in months. When their eyes adjusted to the bright morning sunlight, the sight that met them was overwhelming. The streets of Velp were not filled with gray Nazi uniforms. Instead, they were lined with British and Canadian Allied soldiers, their tanks and military trucks painted with white stars. The local Dutch townspeople, who had been hiding in their own cellars, were pouring out into the thoroughfares. People were weeping openly, falling to their knees, throwing their arms around the soldiers and waving red, white, and blue Dutch flags that had been hidden away for 5 long years. Voices shouted through the streets, carrying a single beautiful realization: it's over. We are free! Allied soldiers had successfully liberated the city. The German occupation was broken. As Ada watched the celebration from her mother's arms, the timing of it all struck her with immense weight. If that Allied bomb had struck just a few feet to the left, her family would have been crushed. If the war had dragged on for just 48 hours longer, her malnourished body would have given up, and she would have died a nameless casualty in that dark cellar. Against all mathematical odds, she had survived to see the dawn of freedom. Within weeks of Velp's liberation, the Allied forces systematically dismantled the remaining Nazi strongholds across Europe. Germany surrendered, and World War II came to an official end. The world began the long, painful process of healing, and so did Ada. The physical scars of the war, however, ran deep. Although she was slowly nursed back to health with the help of international relief organizations, the prolonged period of severe starvation and the injuries she sustained during the occupation had done permanent damage to her body. Her respiratory system was compromised, and her muscle development had been severely disrupted during crucial years of growth. When she finally returned to the dance studio, she had to face a heartbreaking reality. Her body could no longer handle the extreme, punishing demands of a professional, full-time prima ballerina. Her childhood dream was dead. But the spirit that had carried her through the Dutch resistance refused to be crushed. Realizing that one path was closed, she pivoted with grace. She began taking jobs as a fashion model to support her family, her striking aristocratic features and slender frame catching the eyes of photographers. Soon after, she tried her hand at acting, finding that the intense discipline, emotional depth, and poise she had developed during the terrifying years of the war translated beautifully to the stage and screen. She eventually left Europe behind and moved to the United States, targeting the heart of the entertainment world, Hollywood. In 1953, a mere 8 years after she had been a starving, skeletal 15-year-old girl waiting for death in a dusty Dutch basement, she was cast as the lead actress in a romantic comedy called Roman Holiday. Playing opposite Gregory Peck, her performance captured the hearts of audiences worldwide. She exuded a rare, luminous charm, a quiet strength, and an unmistakable elegance that set her completely apart from the typical Hollywood stars of the era. The film was a triumph, and for her very first major role, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress. The horrors of World War II had taken an immense toll on her life. It had stolen her uncle, threatened her family, and destroyed her ultimate dream of ballet. Yet, the brutal crucible of the war had also gifted her with a profound empathy, an unbreakable resilience, and a deep appreciation for the fragility of human life. These qualities not only made her one of the most successful, iconic, and revered actresses in the history of cinema, but they also guided her later years, during which she stepped away from the cameras to travel the world as a deeply dedicated UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, fighting to save starving children in war-torn regions just as she had been saved. When she achieved global fame, she chose to leave her childhood nickname Ada in the past. Instead, the world came to know her by the name that remains synonymous with grace, timeless beauty, and humanitarian devotion: Audrey Hepburn. On a humid morning in the summer of 1889, a 36-year-old surgeon named Dr. William Halstead stood in an operating prep room at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. Standing beside him was his 27-year-old head nurse, Caroline Hampton. They were preparing for an upcoming surgery, but before Dr. Halstead would even think about picking up a scalpel, he had to watch Caroline complete a grueling ritual. Caroline stood before a row of porcelain sinks filled with various liquids. First, she scrubbed her hands and forearms with scalding hot water and heavy-duty antibacterial soap. Next, she used harsh brushes and metal files to clean beneath her fingernails. Then came the painful part. She dipped her bare hands directly into a bowl of harsh acid, followed by a 5-minute soak in a highly corrosive chemical solution called mercury bichloride. Dr. Halstead ran a remarkably tight ship, especially when it came to hand hygiene. Today, we know that washing our hands before medical procedures is common sense, but in 1889, it was a radical and highly controversial concept. At the time, germ theory, the idea that microscopic organisms cause diseases and infections, was brand new. Most doctors flatly rejected it. Surgeons would routinely walk from an autopsy room straight into a delivery room without washing their hands or cleaning their tools, completely unaware that they were carrying deadly bacteria to their patients. Dr. Halstead, however, was a firm believer in germ theory. He was obsessed with cleanliness, which is why he created this brutal multi-step scrubbing routine for his surgical team. While other hospitals across the United States suffered from terrifyingly high post-surgery infection rates, Dr. Halstead's department boasted some of the lowest mortality rates in the country. His methods worked beautifully, but they came at a severe physical cost to his staff. The chemicals they used were toxic, eating away at human skin day after day. On this particular morning, as Dr. Halstead watched Caroline let her hands air dry, he noticed just how badly she was hurting. Her hands and forearms were covered in angry red blisters, raw rashes, and painful cracked skin. It was a terrible sight, and Dr. Halstead felt a deep pang of guilt. He felt guilty for 2 reasons. First, Caroline was an incredible worker. Despite the immense pain the daily chemical baths caused her, she never once complained. She followed his strict rules flawlessly, which was exactly why he had promoted her to head nurse. She possessed an iron will and a profound dedication to her job. But the second, much deeper reason for his guilt was a secret he kept buried in his heart. Dr. Halstead was madly in love with Caroline. He had never told her how he felt. He believed he was too old for her, and he assumed a brilliant, capable woman like Caroline would never be interested in a serious, work-obsessed surgeon like himself. So he loved her from afar, keeping his feelings strictly professional while remaining intensely protective of her. Watching the woman he secretly adored destroy her skin every day just to satisfy his protocols was tearing him apart. For the first time, Dr. Halstead began to question his own system. He desperately wanted to tell Caroline that she could skip the chemical scrub to let her hands heal, but he was trapped by his own reputation. He was the leading champion of germ theory in America. If he made a special exception for his head nurse, word would spread, his credibility would be ruined, and his staff would stop taking the hygiene rules seriously. He needed a workaround, a solution that would protect Caroline's hands without compromising the sterile environment of his operating room. Months passed, and as the calendar turned to early 1890, Dr. Halstead sat alone in his office. On his desk lay a small, neatly wrapped package that had just arrived. He looked at it with a mixture of nervous anticipation and intense hope. For nearly a year, he had been trying to solve his dilemma. Finally, he had come up with an out-of-the-box idea and reached out to the Goodyear Rubber Company to see if they could manufacture a highly specific prototype. Dr. Halstead tore open the package. Inside were 2 strange, thin, flexible objects made of dark, vulcanized rubber. Without wasting a single second, he grabbed them, hurried out of his office, and marched down the hallway to the operating prep room. As expected, he found Caroline standing by the sinks, lifting her raw, blistered hands to begin the agonizing scrubbing process. Dr. Halstead stepped forward and gently stopped her. He held out the 2 rubber objects and told her to put them on instead of dipping her hands into the chemicals. Caroline looked at the strange items, looked at her bleeding hands, and with a confused but trusting nod, pulled them over her fingers. Within just 1 week, the results were undeniable. Because the rubber acted as an impenetrable barrier, Carolyn no longer had to plunge her bare skin into corrosive acids. Her hands and forearms healed beautifully, returning to their natural, healthy state. Seeing Caroline out of pain gave Dr. Halstead a massive surge of confidence. The joy of seeing her heal finally gave him the courage to break his silence. He confessed his deep love to Caroline, and to his absolute amazement, she revealed that she had been secretly in love with him too. Not long after, Dr. Halstead asked for her hand in marriage, and she happily said yes. While their love story was beautiful, it was the clever workaround Dr. Halstead invented out of love that would echo through history. Initially, he had only commissioned those rubber coverings to protect his fiancée's skin. But very quickly, Dr. Halstead and the rest of the Johns Hopkins medical team noticed a fascinating side effect. The patients Caroline operated on had even fewer post-surgery infections than before. The medical community realized that these rubber barriers didn't just protect the nurse's skin from chemicals, they also protected the patient from any stray germs remaining on a human hand. Soon, every surgeon, nurse, and doctor across the globe adopted the practice. Because a brilliant doctor fell deeply in love with his head nurse, he inadvertently created one of the most widely used and life-saving medical tools in human history: the world's very first pair of rubber surgical gloves. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine taking a short, quiet walk on a bright afternoon just a single mile away from a safe, busy police station. You are doing nothing out of the ordinary, perhaps just heading home or going to meet a friend. You make a quick, split-second decision to step inside a car believing you are safe, but that single decision erases you from the face of the earth. There is no struggle, no scream, and no clues left behind. Just an empty road and a family whose lives are shattered in an instant. This is exactly what happened to a young woman named Cherita Thomas in the year 1980. She was a vibrant young person with dreams and a routine that she followed every single day. She was loved by her family, and she had no reason to run away. But on that quiet day, she was walking down a road in northern Michigan. She was close to the local police station, a place where she should have been safe. An older man pulled up next to her in his car. He offered her a ride, and for reasons we will never fully know, she got in. The car drove off, blending into the normal flow of traffic, and Cherita was never seen alive again. For over 20 years, this mystery hung over the small community like a heavy, suffocating fog. It was a case that deeply haunted a local police officer named Sergeant Alan McGregor. He had worked out of that very police station, and the fact that a young woman had disappeared so close to his office without a trace was something he simply could not accept. In the days and weeks after Cherita disappeared, the police worked tirelessly to find out what had happened to her. They followed every lead and interviewed everyone who had been in the area that day. Soon, their investigation led them to an older man named Jimmy Nelson. Based on tips from the community and several circumstantial clues, the investigators became nearly certain that Jimmy was the man who had picked Cherita up on the side of the road. Their theory was dark and straightforward. They believed Jimmy had driven her to a remote area, murdered her shortly after picking her up, and then hidden her body in a particular section of the Huron National Forest. The Huron National Forest is a massive, sprawling nature preserve in northern Michigan. It covers thousands of acres of dense woods, thick brush, and swampy terrain. It is the kind of place where something could remain hidden forever if you did not know exactly where to look. But the problem was that the police did not have any actual evidence that supported this theory. Their case against Jimmy was entirely circumstantial. In fact, they did not even know if Cherita had really been murdered because for the last 20-plus years, they had searched that particular section of the Huron National Forest. They had gotten the FBI involved. They had chased down every lead. Yet still, they had not found Cherita's body. So, they really did not know what happened. For 21 years, the dense canopy of the Huron National Forest remained a silent vault. Every single expedition returned empty-handed, and the local community began to lose hope. But McGregor kept a map of the forest pinned to his wall, staring at the green vastness every night. He knew that the forest held the truth, but it was simply too massive for human eyes to scan alone. They needed something more. But as Sergeant McGregor neared the forest, he hoped that today would be the day that all changed. On the morning of the 30th of August 2001, Sergeant McGregor drove with his partner, Officer Mark David, towards the Huron National Forest. The two of them were on the way to this forest to meet with a very unlikely detective who McGregor believed might actually be the key to solving a case that had haunted him for the last 21 years. He pulled up by the entrance of the Huron National Forest, and he and his partner got their first look at their unlikely detective they were here to meet. And this detective was a Doberman Pinscher mix with big floppy ears who was lying on the ground and panting and wagging his tail. His name was Eagle, and he did not look like a stereotypical police dog because he was not a police dog. However, Eagle was the best crime scene sniffing dog in the entire world. His trainer, a 40-year-old woman named Sandra Anderson, was standing right beside him. Now, Sandra and Eagle were very famous in law enforcement circles, and so Sergeant McGregor and his partner were already well aware of their backstory. Sandra had actually adopted Eagle from a pound shortly before he likely would have been euthanized. And then after she adopted him, Sandra, who had made a career in teaching dogs how to sniff for cadavers, just sort of naturally on her off time, began training Eagle how to do it too. And amazingly, Eagle really took to it better than police dogs did. Sandra claimed that Eagle possessed a unique sensitivity to the chemical compounds of human bones, allowing him to easily bypass animal remains and other distractions. Her phone was constantly ringing with requests from across the country. Whenever a high-profile case went cold, prosecutors and sheriff departments looked to Sandra and her famous Doberman mix to find what they could not. Now, any good police cadaver dog could sniff out hidden objects and track a scent for miles, and Eagle could definitely do that. But also, Eagle could do things that the police cadaver dogs simply could not. Like, he could smell blood that had been cleaned with bleach and also painted over. I mean, that is like a superpower. No dog could do that, but Eagle could. One forensic anthropologist who had come in contact with Eagle and seen what he could do firsthand said that, if a great cadaver dog was rated a 10 out of 10, well, Eagle was like a 20 out of 10. He was far and away the best of the best. And so Sergeant McGregor believed that if Charita's body really was in that section of the Huron National Forest, well, Eagle would be able to find it. Sergeant McGregor was excited to see Eagle in action. But after he and his partner parked, they walked over and spent a minute, petting Eagle because Sandra said it was fine. And they gave him some pets, and Eagle really liked it, and he sort of rubbed up against them. But then at some point, Eagle just kind of stopped and looked towards the entrance of the National Forest like he was ready to go. At which point, Sandra said that he was ready to work. So Sergeant McGregor and his partner followed behind Sandra and Eagle as they led the way into the forest towards the section where they had been told to search. Once they reached that section, McGregor and his partner kind of stayed back on the fringes and just watched Eagle work, and it was incredible. Now, McGregor and his partner had seen police dogs work before, so they were familiar with basically the pace at which these dogs would find something, which often, it would take some time. But basically, as soon as they got to this clearing, they are watching Eagle, and he is sort of walking around sniffing, looking for something. But then suddenly, he stopped, turned, and made a beeline towards this tree. And when he got there, he began pawing at the ground like he had found something. Sandra, his trainer, kneeled down next to him to see what Eagle had found. And she saw, as he continued to dig, that there was something in the ground. And so she called out to McGregor and his partner, and they came rushing over. And sure enough, Eagle had found a human bone fragment. To be clear, this dog only finds human bones. And so it is not like he would be able to find a chicken bone and think it was a human bone. Basically, if he found a bone, it is a human bone. McGregor and his partner were totally shocked here. I mean, they had really high hopes for the search, but to already be finding human remains in this particular section of the forest was revolutionary. I mean, not only was it a big deal to find human remains here, but these could be Chirita's. This could be the key to unlocking this 2 decades old case. But Sandra, Eagle's trainer, did not seem shocked at all. This was pretty much par for the course. She smiled at the 2 investigators and kind of shrugged like, yep, this is what he does. She gave him a treat, and then Eagle got up and just continued searching the area. After Sandra and Eagle had taken off, McGregor and his partner bagged the bone fragment and then just kind of continued to let Eagle do his work. And over the course of that day, Eagle just kept on finding more human bones. It was truly incredible. And then the next day, when they came back for a second search, Eagle found even more. It was like there were human bones all over the place. However, this was actually kind of typical for human remains that have been left out in the wild for a long time, like they believed Chirita's had been. The idea is, after the body is left there and decomposes, animals come along and break apart the bones and kind of carry them in different directions. There is weather, there's a bunch of things that affect the body that sort of gradually takes it and spreads it all over the place. But as alarming as it was to find this many human bone fragments in such a small area in this forest, at the end of that second search on the second day, McGregor, all he could feel was elation. He felt like Eagle had done the exact thing he was hoping he would do. He had found the remains that very likely were Chirita Thomas's. McGregor thanked Sandra and Eagle profusely for their help. And then, after saying bye to them, he and his partner went back to the station, and they sent off the bone fragments to the FBI to be analyzed. And then after sending them off, they waited. The analysis would take several months, but in February of 2002, the FBI finally called McGregor. Now, at this point, McGregor was very hopeful and sort of expected that these bone fragments would belong to Chirita. But what they actually said shocked him because according to the FBI, those bone fragments that Eagle had dug up did not belong to Chirita. In fact, the bone fragments did not even belong to a single person. They belonged to 3 different people. And when McGregor heard this, his blood ran cold because he was not thinking, oh boy, this totally blows up the case. Instead, he is thinking, I bet Chirita is out in that forest. We just have not found her yet, and if we keep using Eagle, we will find her. But now I have at least 3 more people that have been found out there. 3 dead people. So maybe Jimmy is way worse than I thought he was. Maybe he did not just kill Chirita. Maybe he is a serial killer, and he is dumping his bodies in that part of the forest. However, as explosive as this new information was, it only made things way more complicated for McGregor because he and his partner and all of his colleagues had no idea who these 3 new bodies were. And neither did the FBI. The FBI could only determine that these bone fragments came from 3 different people, but who they were, they did not know. And so to try to figure out who these 3 people were, Sergeant McGregor would need to find more clues. The FBI agents who processed the DNA were deeply unsettled. They had to double-check their results multiple times because they could not believe that a simple search for one missing person had suddenly uncovered a potential burial site for multiple individuals. When McGregor received the news, he sat at his desk in silence, feeling a heavy mixture of horror and determination. If there were 3 other victims out there, he had to find them. And to find more clues, he needed Eagle to go back to the forest and keep on looking. And so he immediately reached out to Sandra, who said that she and Eagle would come back out there and search the forest again. The new search began on the 17th of April, 2002. McGregor, his partner Sandra, Eagle, and a whole bunch of police officers and crime lab technicians descended once again on that same section of the Huron National Forest. But after a kind of lengthy search that day, the police officers, the entire police force that showed up, they did not find anything of note. But Eagle, he did. At some point, Eagle had sniffed out a human knuckle bone in a dried-out stream bed. When this discovery was made, Sergeant McGregor was elated because it was like, once again, we are finding evidence that is going to help him break this case. He has been trying to crack for 20 years, which now might actually be way bigger than he thought it was. It might not just be the murder of Charita. This might be the hunting grounds or the dumping grounds of a serial killer who killed Charita Thomas. And he, McGregor, was going to be the one who solved it. He just knew it. But when McGregor turned back around to continue searching in the area that he was looking, he suddenly heard this commotion coming from behind him, sort of in the same direction where that human knucklebone had been found. And he turns around and he sees what looks to be some sort of physical altercation happening amongst two people. He cannot really tell who it is, but there is screaming happening. It is total chaos. And so, having no idea what was going on, McGregor abandoned his search, turned and ran to go break it up. And after this fight was broken up, another major discovery was made. But it was not another bone. It would turn out the person who was dumping bodies in this section of the Huron National Forest was not a serial killer, nor was it Jimmy Nelson. Instead, the real culprit was actually one of the investigators who was out here doing the search right now. Eagle was not the world's greatest cadaver-sniffing dog. In fact, Eagle was not even a cadaver-sniffing dog at all. And his trainer, Sandra, was well aware of that because this was all a big act. It would turn out when Sandra and her dog were called out to a site to perform a search, Sandra would show up with a stash of human bones tucked into her clothing right up against her skin. And then, once the search began, she would discreetly pull little bone fragments out and drop them on the ground in front of Eagle, who would immediately notice them and alert people to them, making it seem like Sandra and her dog had once again saved the day. Sandra did this dozens of times across dozens of searches all over the country, all because she loved the thrill of watching the police discover her crimes in real time. Sandra had been successfully searching for body parts that she herself had planted for years without anybody being remotely suspicious of her. The investigation into Sandra's background revealed a highly calculated routine of deception. She had built connections with medical labs and research facilities, using her credentials to quietly walk away with bone samples. She would keep these pieces in small jars at home, choosing specific fragments for each search to match the age and profile of the victim she was pretending to find. She was playing a dangerous, thrill-seeking game. However, during the search for Charita Thomas, Sandra got caught. Right before that fight broke out on that last search, Sandra and her dog had stepped off to the side and believed nobody was watching them. And Sandra bent down and pulled a bone fragment out of her sock and was about to place it, but then realized a crime lab technician was clearly watching her. She had been caught, and so the crime lab technician went up to Sandra to call her out on it. And Sandra, who knew she was caught, began to panic and pretended that she was being attacked by the crime lab technician and made a whole scene about it. That is what McGregor heard when he turned around and wondered if there was a fight going on. There was no fight. It was just Sandra again being caught red-handed. But as awful as Sandra's actions sound, she did not actually kill anyone. Instead, during her years-long run of fraudulent searching, she had been stealing pieces of medical center cadavers and using those. Sandra ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple felonies, including falsifying evidence and obstruction of justice. And so she was sentenced to 21 months in prison. After she was caught, the FBI had to go back and reevaluate 50 murder cases that Sandra and Eagle had been involved in. Luckily, though, during this examination, they discovered that in all of these cases, they did not hinge on evidence that Sandra had found, and so there were no convictions that were overturned. As for Jimmy Nelson, he was eventually convicted of Charita's murder. However, his conviction was overturned, but it had nothing to do with Sandra and Eagle. The evidence used to overturn it was completely separate. And so to this day, we still do not know what happened to Charita, and her body has still not been found. As for Eagle, nobody was mad at him, and he retired from working crime scenes and got as many treats as he wanted until he passed away peacefully in 2003. The mystery of what happened on that country road remains a dark shadow in northern Michigan. The family of Charita Thomas looks at the quiet forest, wondering if the truth will ever finally surface, completely free from the complex web of lies that once derailed their hope. They are left with only the precious memories of a vibrant young woman who stepped into a car and vanished, leaving behind a haunting story of a search that was tragically broken by human greed, while the quiet woods keep their secrets. More than 20 years later, the forest still has not given up its final secret. And perhaps the most disturbing part of this entire story is that the biggest lie was never hidden in the woods. It was standing beside the investigators the whole time. If you want to watch more true crime stories with twists just like this one, check out the next video on the channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time. It was a cold afternoon in the winter of 2015, and 57-year-old Patricia Duray was asleep on her couch inside her home in France. She had the day off from her job as a reporter for a local radio station, and she decided to spend it relaxing, just watching a movie. But at some point, she'd clearly drifted off. The sound that woke her was the familiar ding of her cell phone. Patricia slowly opened her eyes, feeling groggy and a bit disoriented. She blinked a few times, letting her living room come back into focus. The movie was still playing quietly on the television, the credits rolling. She must have been out for a while. She reached over to the coffee table and picked up her phone to see who had messaged her. The screen lit up showing a new text, but it was from a number she didn't have saved in her contacts. She tapped on the notification, and the message that appeared on her screen was strange, to say the least. It read in French, "The castle wants you. The castle is calling you. Come." For a moment, Patricia just stared at the words, completely baffled. It made no sense at all. It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. She scrolled up, and that's when she saw there were other messages in the thread from this same number, messages she had received months ago. And in that instant, she remembered exactly who this was. The person sending these cryptic texts was a middle-aged woman named Bérengère. About 8 months before this, Bérengère had approached Patricia while she was out in public. She had seemed frantic, telling Patricia that she was in desperate need of her help. The reason, Bérengère had explained, was that she worked in a castle, and that castle was haunted. Now, for most people, this would be a very strange request to receive from a stranger. But for Patricia, it wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. You see, in addition to being a well-respected local news reporter, Patricia Duray was also a self-proclaimed psychic medium. She genuinely believed she had the ability to communicate with the dead, and it was a part of her life she was very passionate about. In fact, she was quite famous for it throughout France. Because of her public profile, both as a journalist and as a medium, she attracted a lot of attention. People would often come to her with stories of paranormal activity. They'd claim their house was haunted, that they'd seen a ghost, or that strange things were happening that they couldn't explain. Patricia always tried to approach these situations with an open mind, but she was also a pragmatist. She knew that most of the time there was a perfectly logical explanation. More often than not, when she would follow up on these claims, she'd discover that the ghostly whispers were just drafty windows, the footsteps in the attic were the house settling, and the eerie shadow was just a trick of the light. There were rarely any actual spirits to communicate with. So, the vast majority of the time, when someone approached her with a story about a haunting, she took it with a grain of salt. When Bérengère had first come to her 8 months ago, talking about a haunted castle, Patricia's internal reaction was basically, sure it is. She was polite, of course, but she didn't really believe it. Bérengère, however, had been very persistent. She was clearly distressed and desperate for help. So, mostly just to be kind and to end the conversation, Patricia had given the woman her phone number. Almost immediately after, Bérengère had sent her a couple of texts, but Patricia had intentionally ignored them, filing it away as just another likely dead end. But now, 8 months later, here was Bérengère again, texting her with this bizarre and dramatic message about a castle calling for her. For some reason, this time, it was different. Maybe it was the strange wording of the text, or maybe it was just the fact that Patricia had a rare day off with nothing else to do. Whatever it was, her interest was piqued. She found herself feeling a strange sense of inspiration, a little pull of curiosity. She decided she would actually follow up on this one. She was going to go check out this castle and see for herself what this supposed haunting was all about. About an hour and a half later, Patricia's car pulled up in front of a small, charming cottage. The cottage was situated on the same large property as the castle. From her earlier brief text exchange with Berenger, she knew this was where the woman lived. Patricia parked her car, got out, and walked up the stone path to the front door. She knocked firmly, then waited. There was no answer. The air was still and quiet. After a few moments of silence, she knocked again, this time a little louder. A moment later, the door creaked open. But the person standing in the doorway was not Berenger. It was a middle-aged man, and he looked completely confused to see a stranger standing on his doorstep. The look on his face was one of pure bewilderment. Seeing his confusion, Patricia immediately launched into an explanation. She said, "Hello, I'm looking for Berenger. I'm Patricia. We were just speaking via text message." The man just continued to stare at her, his expression not changing. He seemed to have no idea what she was talking about. It was an awkward and uncomfortable moment. But then, from behind the man, Berenger appeared. As soon as Berenger saw who was at the door, her entire demeanor changed. Her face flooded with relief, and her eyes welled up with tears. She looked like she was about to start weeping with joy. She rushed forward, pushing past the man. "Oh my gosh, thank you so much for coming," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is unbelievable. Thank you. We really need your help." Before Patricia could even ask a question or get a word in, Berenger gestured towards the confused man who had opened the door. By now, his expression had softened a little, though he still looked a bit lost. "This is my husband, Remy," Berenger said. "And he is just as relieved as I am that you're here." At this, Patricia offered the man a polite smile and shook his hand. She turned back to them both and said, "Well, I don't know yet what I can do for you. Why don't you start from the beginning and fill me in? All I really know is that you believe the castle over there is haunted. Can you tell me the story?" Berenger took a moment to compose herself, wiping a tear from her eye. She took a deep breath and then began to explain. About a year ago, her husband, Remy, had been hired as the full-time caretaker for the historic castle on the property. As part of the job, they were given free housing in this very cottage. She had come along to help him with the upkeep. At first, she said, they were both thrilled. It was a wonderful opportunity, a beautiful place to live, and a steady job for Remy. But their excitement didn't last long. Berenger told Patricia that they had only been living and working there for a couple of weeks when the strange things started to happen. She explained that she would often be in the castle by herself, doing her daily chores like cleaning or dusting. She would know for a fact that she was the only person inside the huge, empty building. And yet, she would suddenly hear the clear and unmistakable sound of footsteps, people walking, and sometimes even running around on the floors above her. At this point in the story, Remy chimed in, speaking for the first time. He said, "Yes, I've heard it too. I've heard those same footsteps, and I know the castle is totally empty." He looked at Patricia with wide, earnest eyes. "But it's even stranger than that," he continued. He said he would be working inside the castle and he would hear voices. And he wasn't talking about faint whispers that you might hear in a movie. No, he would hear people screaming at the top of their lungs. The screams would come from distant, unseen parts of the castle, and he said it was absolutely terrifying. As Patricia listened to Remy and Berenger tell their story, she was struck by how genuinely frightened they were. They weren't being dramatic or trying to sensationalize anything. It was clear that whatever they had experienced inside that castle had deeply shaken them. They seemed trapped. Remy's job required him to be there, to go inside the castle every day, but it was becoming an increasingly difficult and stressful ordeal for both of them. They felt like they had nowhere to turn and that no one would take them seriously. Patricia couldn't help but feel a sense of empathy for them. They came across as honest, ordinary people who were caught in an extraordinary and frightening situation. But at the same time, her professional skepticism was still there. She was a veteran in these matters. She had been on numerous house calls to supposedly haunted locations. She knew that screams could be the sound of the wind whistling through a crack in a window, and footsteps could be a raccoon in the attic or a pet walking around somewhere else in the house. There could easily be a rational explanation for everything they were describing, but their fear was so palpable, so real, that she knew it warranted a closer look. There was enough here to convince her that she needed to see the castle for herself. So, after they finished their story, she looked at them both and said, "Okay, let's go over there. Let's go see the castle." A few minutes later, Patricia was following Béranger and Remy along a wooded path that led from their cottage to the castle. Even from a distance, the castle was an imposing sight. It was huge and intimidating, with two very tall round towers on either end. In the middle was a slightly shorter section, decorated with a cluster of smaller turrets that reached up towards the gray sky. The front of the castle, the side they were approaching, only had two visible windows. For a fleeting second, as Patricia looked up at them, she had an uneasy feeling that the windows were like two giant eyes, and the castle itself was watching her approach. She quickly shook the feeling off, telling herself not to get carried away, and kept walking. A few moments later, they arrived at the castle's massive front door, which was made of thick, dark wood. Remy pulled out a huge, old-fashioned key ring that was heavy with dozens of keys. He found the right one, inserted it into the lock, and turned it with a loud, metallic clank. Then he pushed the heavy door open and stepped aside, gesturing for Patricia to go inside first. Patricia took a steadying breath, trying her best to remain professional and objective. She was not going to buy into the hype just yet. This could still be something completely normal. But as she stepped over the threshold and into the castle, she found herself in an enormous, empty space known as the Great Hall. The first thing she noticed was how incredibly dark and cold it was inside. Of course, it was an old stone castle, so a certain level of cold was to be expected. But this felt different. It was an eerie, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The air itself felt heavy, thick, with a kind of oppressive silence. It was not a welcoming place. It was the kind of place that made you want to turn around and leave immediately. Patricia took another deep breath, trying to center herself and focus on the task at hand. She looked around the Great Hall more closely. There were a few windows on the far wall, but their heavy wooden shutters were all closed tight, plunging the room into shadow. Directly in front of her was a grand, sweeping stone staircase that led up to the upper floors. To her right and to her left, she could see long, dark hallways that she knew must lead to dozens of other rooms. After a few moments of just taking it all in, Patricia turned to Béranger. She said, "Okay, so you mentioned you've heard footsteps upstairs when you knew this place was empty. Can you remember what you were doing on any of those occasions? What were you doing the last time you heard the sounds?" Béranger thought for a second and then nodded. "Actually, yes, I do remember," she said. "The last time it happened, I was closing the shutters on those windows over there. And I know I heard people walking around upstairs while I was doing that." Instantly, Patricia's practical mind went to work. That could be it. Maybe the sound of the old heavy shutters moving was creating some kind of echo or vibration that in this cavernous space could be mistaken for footsteps. It was a plausible theory. "Okay," Patricia said, "let's go test the shutters. Let's just see if that could be causing the strange sounds you're hearing." Béranger and Remy didn't seem offended by her suggestion at all. In fact, they seemed eager to find a rational explanation for what was happening. They wanted it to be something simple. So, the three of them walked over to one of the large windows. Patricia reached out, grabbed the wooden handles of the shutters, and pulled them open. Then she pushed them closed. She did this a few more times, listening carefully. But there were no strange sounds. There was the creak of the old wood and the thud as they closed, but certainly nothing that could be confused with the sound of footsteps running around upstairs. It was a dead end. This was not the explanation. Still, just to be thorough, Patricia decided she would try one of the other shutters. Maybe one of them was faulty or made a different noise. She walked over to the next window and reached for the shutter. But before her hand even made contact with the wood, a loud, sudden, high-pitched shrieking sound echoed through the entire castle. It seemed to come from somewhere high above them on one of the upper floors. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped, and the castle was plunged back into a deadly, unnerving silence. Immediately, the hairs on the back of Patricia's neck stood on end. It was an unmistakable sound, a human-like shriek of terror or pain. She turned to look at Remy and Berenger. They were both frozen, their faces pale with fear. They had obviously heard things like this before, but it was clear that it was just as terrifying every single time. Patricia stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, not sure what to do next. She forced herself to stay calm. Wait a minute, she told herself silently. That couldn't have been what it sounded like. There has to be a logical explanation. Part of the reason for her skepticism was that even in all her years as a psychic medium, she had never experienced anything so direct, so visceral. A ghostly scream was something you saw in movies, not something that happened in real life. So she turned to the terrified couple and said in a calm voice, "Look, I obviously heard that too. But let's not rule out that it could have been the wind or something else. Let's not jump to conclusions here. Let's be rational, let's be pragmatic. Let's just search the castle and see what we're dealing with." Remy and Berenger did not look reassured in the slightest, but they nodded meekly, willing to follow her lead. But before anyone could move, before anyone could even take a step, it happened again. Another sudden, loud, high-pitched scream ripped through the silence, this time from a different location upstairs. It sounded like a different voice. And then, once again, it was gone, leaving only a ringing in their ears and a thick, heavy silence. At that moment, it became very clear to Patricia, and certainly to the couple, that this was not the wind. The castle might just be haunted after all. There was something very wrong happening here. As Patricia stood there, trying to process what was happening and figure out what their next move should be, because she was now, by default, the expert in charge, a powerful and strange feeling came over her. She would later describe it as a pull, like a magnet was inside her, pulling her in the direction of where the screams had come from. She felt an overwhelming and undeniable urge to go upstairs, to the second floor, to find the source of those sounds. She felt like she had to. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was a compulsion. She wasn't even sure if it was her own psychic abilities kicking in, or if it was the castle itself drawing her deeper into its shadows. Without saying a word to Remy and Berenger, without even a glance in their direction, Patricia silently turned and began to walk, almost as if against her will, towards the huge stone staircase that led to the upper levels. The castle was now completely silent again. The only sound was the soft echo of their own footsteps on the stone floor as they moved towards the stairs. Remy and Berenger, their faces masks of terror, huddled closely behind Patricia, following her lead, not knowing what else to do. Up the stairs they went. Patricia was still in the grip of that intense feeling, that pull that she couldn't control. Up and up the stone steps she climbed, with the frightened couple close behind. No one spoke. The only sound was their breathing and the scuff of their shoes on the stone. They went all the way up to the third floor, which is where she felt the screams had most likely originated. At the top of the stairs, Patricia, acting almost on instinct, turned to her left and started walking down a long, dark hallway. The hallway was lined with closed doors on either side. Again, the castle was unnervingly quiet. All they could hear was the sound of their own footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Down the long hallway they walked, all the way to a dead end. And at the very end of the hallway, there was a single closed door. At this point, Patricia, almost as if she were a different person, turned and spoke to Remy in a sharp, almost aggressive tone. "Get your keys out," she commanded. "Open this door." She didn't even know why she was being so forceful. The words just came out of her. Berenger, however, spoke up, her voice trembling. "The owner of the castle," she whispered. "They told us this is the one room we are not allowed to go in. We've never been inside. We can't go in there." Patricia just looked at her, her expression unyielding. "I don't care," she said, her voice firm. "We have to go in. Open the door. I'm going in. I have to go in this room." Berenger looked at her husband, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Remy just gave a slight shrug. They were in way over their heads and had no idea what to do. They figured they had to trust Patricia. She was the expert after all. So Remy pulled out his big ring of keys again. He fumbled through them, his hands shaking slightly, trying to find the right one. Patricia stood there, practically vibrating with the need to get into that room. She couldn't understand the feeling, but it was all-consuming. Finally, Remy found the key. He reached out, put it in the lock, and turned it. He pushed the door open, and Patricia immediately walked inside. As the door swung open, Remy and Berenger got their first look inside the forbidden room. And it was completely unremarkable. It was just a vacant, empty room. There was no furniture, no decorations, nothing at all. There was no obvious reason why this specific room would be off-limits. But as they stood in the doorway and watched Patricia walk slowly and methodically to the center of the room, they could have sworn they heard the faint sound of whispers suddenly starting up inside the empty space. Patricia came to a stop in the very middle of the room, her back facing them. And then things got even stranger. Patricia, who was now acting very differently from the calm professional who had first arrived, just stood there, rigid, staring towards the back wall of the dark room as the whispers seemed to grow louder. From their vantage point in the doorway, Berenger and Remy watched in horror as Patricia's body began to twitch. Her shoulders moved in jerky, unnatural ways, and her neck snapped to the side at a strange angle. And then she began to let out a horrible, croaking sound. It was a constant, single-tone, guttural noise. It went on and on for so long that it seemed impossible. She should have needed to take a breath to continue, but she didn't. The sound just emanated from her, relentless and unsettling. Remy and Berenger were now terrified, not of the castle, but of Patricia. As she was twitching and croaking, she suddenly stopped, whipped around, and faced them. Her mouth was hanging open, her jaw completely slack, and that awful croaking sound was still coming out of her. But they could also see that she was weeping. Tears were streaming down her face. Remy and Berenger were beyond terrified, but they could also see that Patricia was in some kind of crisis, and they wanted to help. They were just about to ask her what was wrong, what they could do, when a loud slamming sound echoed up from one of the lower floors. It sounded like a heavy door had been slammed shut with incredible force. The noise seemed to snap Patricia out of whatever trance she was in. Her expression changed in an instant. She became focused, alert. And then, without a word to the couple, she bolted right past them, sprinted out of the room, and ran down the hallway and down the stairs. She was chasing after the sound. Remy and Berenger looked at each other, stunned. What else could they do but follow her? So they ran down the hallway, several paces behind Patricia, who was already somewhere on a lower floor. They got down to the second floor and could hear movement coming from one of the rooms down the hall. Then they heard a loud, almost animalistic yelling sound. It seemed to be Patricia, yelling or growling or something from inside one of the rooms. They cautiously made their way in that direction and saw an open door that led into a bedroom. Off of the bedroom was a small bathroom. They went into the bedroom and looked into the bathroom. And there was Patricia. Her back was to them, and she was on her knees, weeping uncontrollably. She was looking up at something in the room, something they couldn't see. They could see her face from an angle, and it was contorted in pure horror. She was looking at something that was terrifying her, but to them, the bathroom was completely empty. Remy and Berenger didn't hesitate. They rushed into the bathroom and grabbed Patricia. She seemed to resist, not wanting to leave, but they were stronger. They dragged her out of the bathroom, pulled her to her feet, and literally, forcibly, removed her from the castle out into the fresh air. Several hours later, Berenger and Remy were back inside their cozy cottage. They were sitting in their living room, with stacks of old papers and historical documents scattered all over their coffee table. Sitting with them was Patricia. By this point, she was mostly back to her normal self, but she was still visibly shaken by what had happened inside the castle. She was now able to explain to the couple what she had experienced from her perspective. She told them that she had, in fact, gone into a kind of trance, a psychic medium experience unlike any she had ever had before. This was on a completely different level. It was visceral and terrifyingly real. According to Patricia, when she had walked into that locked, forbidden room on the third floor, the room was not empty for her. When she was pulled in there, what she saw was a room filled with people, entities, or ghosts. Berenger and Remy couldn't see them, but Patricia could. She said they were all wearing different kinds of clothes, from different time periods. There were people dressed in medieval peasant outfits, women in Victorian dresses, and men in 20th century business suits. But the most powerful impression she got was not their appearance, but their emotional state. She could feel how lost and scared these spirits were. They seemed to be in trouble. Patricia said she felt like she was pulled into the center of the room and then anchored there, unable to move. As she stood there, these ghosts began to crowd in on her, getting closer and closer, as if they were desperately trying to get her help. She felt overcome by a suffocating, claustrophobic feeling. It wasn't their physical presence that was overwhelming her, it was their sadness. Their collective loneliness and desperation washed over her in waves, and it was so powerful and so awful that it made her weep uncontrollably. Eventually, she said, she was able to force her body to turn around and at least look towards the exit. That's when she heard the loud slamming door from downstairs. The sudden noise seemed to startle the spirits, and they backed away from her, which gave her the chance to bolt from the room. Patricia then explained that when she ran out and started heading in the direction of the slammed door, the feeling of being pulled was very different. The pull that had led her up to the third floor had felt neutral, maybe even positive, like something was guiding her to help. But this new pull, leading her down to the second floor, felt totally different. It was dark. She knew that something evil was pulling her towards it. But still, almost against her own will, she ran down the hallway, down the stairs, and into that bedroom, with Berenger and Remy following behind. When she went into the bathroom, she saw something so terrifying that she just collapsed to her knees and began to scream. That was the animalistic wailing that the couple had heard. What she saw was an enormous, tall, Guzek figure. It was the ghost of a man, covered in deep scars, wearing rusted chainmail armor, like a knight from a long-forgotten time. She said he radiated pure evil. It was a dark, malevolent presence. She knew that was the source of the dark feeling that had pulled her there. She felt like it was trying to pull her to her death, and she believes that it was only because Remy and Berenger came in and physically pulled her away that she was able to escape. After Patricia finished her incredible story, the three of them sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. They had to figure out what it all meant. They quickly decided to focus on the most immediate threat. The evil entity, the tall man in the rusted armor. Who was he? And what did he want? Berenger and Remy had already gathered up a bunch of historical documents about the castle, and they had spread them out on the coffee table. Together, they started going through them, looking for any clue that might explain who this terrifying spirit could be. As they were looking through the old papers, one particular section caught Patricia's eye. She felt a strange pull towards it. A feeling that she needed to read it. It was a section about a knight named Jean who had lived in the 14th century. The document said that Jean had been a soldier during the 100 Years' War, a long and brutal conflict between England and France. During that war, the castle had been used as a French military fortress, and Jean, the knight, had been killed in a battle that took place right there at the castle. After Patricia read this out loud, she told Berenger and Remy that she just had a feeling. She couldn't explain why, but she was certain that the evil spirit she had seen in the bathroom, the tall man in the armor, was the ghost of Jean. However, even if she was right, it didn't solve their problem. They still didn't know why he was there, why he had appeared to her, or why any of this was happening, and who were all the other ghosts in the room on the third floor. None of it made any more sense. Berenger eventually looked at Patricia and asked, "What do you think all this means? What do we do?" But Patricia was still deeply shaken. She was a renowned psychic, but she had never experienced anything this intense. It was truly terrifying. She just shook her head and said, "Look, I'm overwhelmed. I need to go home. I need to go home and just think about all of this. I need to process what happened here." Remy and Berenger were obviously disappointed, and probably terrified at the thought of being left alone with the haunted castle, but they understood. They couldn't force her to stay. So, Patricia got up and left, leaving them alone with their fear. After she was gone, Berenger and Remy made a pact. They agreed that even though it was Remy's job to look after the castle, it was just too dangerous to go inside for now. They would stay away, at least until Patricia came back and they could figure out what to do. For the next couple of days, life was surprisingly normal for them. As long as they stayed away from the castle, nothing strange happened at all. They just lived in their cottage and tried to go about their lives. But Patricia didn't call, and she didn't come back. She was at her own home, trying to come to terms with her terrifying experience. And during this time, Berenger started to feel a strange sensation in her chest. It was a feeling of needing to go to the castle. It was a pull, very similar to what Patricia had described. She tried to ignore it, to fight it, but the feeling just grew stronger. She felt this undeniable compulsion to go over there. Then one day, Remy was looking out the window of their cottage, and he saw his wife, Berenger, walking purposefully across the lawn, straight towards the front door of the castle. He knew immediately what was happening. He thought there's no way she should be going in there. We agreed. He ran out of the cottage, raced over to her, and literally grabbed her and pulled her back just moments before she could go inside. When he pulled her away, she seemed to snap out of it, and she couldn't even explain why she was there. She just said, "I don't know. I just felt like I had to come over here." But that wasn't even the strangest thing that happened in those few days. Shortly after that incident, a random man had wandered onto the castle grounds. He didn't seem to know why he was there, but he too was being drawn towards the castle. As this man was walking towards the front door, a deer, which also seemed to be drawn to the castle, came running out of the woods and rammed into the man with incredible force. He was injured so badly that he had to be hospitalized, and he actually lost an eye in the incident. After this happened, Berenger and Remy knew they couldn't wait any longer. They had been trying to give Patricia her space, but things were escalating. The dark energy in the castle seemed to be getting stronger, its influence spreading. They had to get in touch with her. Berenger called Patricia and told her everything that had happened. She said, "Whatever's going on in that castle, whatever dark energy is in there, it's getting stronger." At first, Patricia was not eager to return. She had made a conscious decision to stay away. The experience had terrified her, and she didn't want any part of it. But as she listened to Berenger on the phone, she could hear the sheer desperation in her voice. Berenger and Remy were at their wits' end. They were lost, and they were turning to her not just as a psychic, but as a friend. They needed her help. So, reluctantly, Patricia agreed to go back. The following evening, the three of them were back inside the castle. They were standing in the second-floor bathroom, the very same room where Patricia had encountered the terrifying entity she now believed was the ghost of Jean. Patricia had come back to attempt an exorcism. She stood in the middle of the small bathroom, while Berenger and Remy huddled together behind her near the doorway. Berenger was so scared she was physically shaking. They watched as Patricia, despite her own fear, stood there calmly with her eyes closed. She was trying to channel the energy in the room to connect with the spirit of John. After a few moments of silent concentration, Patricia seemed to connect with something that Berenger and Remy couldn't see. The room was empty to them, but it was clear that Patricia had found what she was looking for. Then, out of nowhere, her voice boomed through the small bathroom, loud and stern. "Jean, show yourself." Berenger and Remy stared at her, their hearts pounding. Patricia opened her eyes and looked around the room, and then her gaze locked onto something on the other side of the bathroom. She could clearly see something that they couldn't. Patricia, her eyes still fixed on whatever was in the room with them, spoke again in that same loud, commanding voice. "It's over," she said. "You have to move on." She was speaking directly to the entity, to Jean, telling him that his time was up. For a long moment, there was just silence. Berenger and Remy held their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Was Patricia going to go into another trance? But she remained calm, forceful, and anchored to the spot. Nothing happened. It was completely silent. Then Patricia repeated her command, her voice even stronger this time. "It's over. You have to move on." And this time, after she spoke, they all heard it. The sound of banging on a door coming from the third floor directly above them. Then they heard the sound of shuffling footsteps, dozens of them, all over the place. And then the sound of mournful crying. There was more banging. Berenger and Remy clutched each other, terrified. But Patricia remained unmoved, a rock in the center of the storm. And then, suddenly, they heard the distinct sound of a door flying open upstairs. This was followed by the sound of all those footsteps rushing down the hallway, mixed with the sound of crying. But the crying had changed. It was no longer sad. It sounded like blissful crying, like tears of pure joy, as a crowd of spirits charged down the hallway, down the stairs, and out of the castle forever. And then, just like that, it was over. A profound calm fell over the entire castle. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere was gone. Patricia turned away from whatever she had been looking at in the bathroom and faced Remy and Berenger. She was smiling. "It's over," she said softly. "It's okay. Everything's okay now." Patricia later explained to them what had happened. She had been able to channel the ghost of Jean. He had been haunting the castle because he didn't know he was dead. He was stuck in a kind of purgatory, believing he was still fighting the 100 Years' War. For centuries, every time someone died in or around the castle, he would take their spirit and hold it prisoner in that locked room on the third floor. But when Patricia had told him it's over, he understood that she meant the war was over. And at that moment, Jean himself was the one who freed all the prisoners. That was the sound they heard, all the spirits being released, joyful and free at last. And then Jean's own spirit was finally able to find peace and move on. But there is one final strange twist to this story. A short time after the exorcism, when life had returned to normal for everyone, Patricia and Berenger were talking on the phone. At one point in the conversation, Patricia said offhandedly, "You know, Berenger, it's a good thing you texted me again and got me to come back out there. Clearly, I was able to help." "What a good thing it was that you texted me." And Berenger replied, "What do you mean?" Patricia said, "You know, when you texted me that the castle was calling me." "You were right." "It was, and I came over and we took care of it." But Berenger was confused. She said, "I haven't texted you in months. I didn't send you that message." Patricia, surprised, pulled out her phone and found the text. She read it back to Berenger. "The castle wants you. The castle is calling you. Come." And Berenger insisted, "Yeah, I didn't send that to you." And to this day, Patricia, Berenger, and Remy still have no idea who or what sent that fateful text message to Patricia's phone. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In the very early hours of the 27th of March 2003, a 4-year-old boy was lying in his bed in a small farmhouse in rural Ohio. He heard his bedroom door creak open. He figured it was probably just his great-grandparents, Jack and Linda, coming in to check on him like they sometimes did. So, being a little kid, he just squeezed his eyes shut and pretended to be sound asleep. He heard the floorboards groan as whoever it was walked slowly across the room. He could hear them getting closer and closer. And then the sounds stopped. They were standing right next to his bed, looking down at him. He could almost feel them there. His curiosity got the better of him. He opened his eyes, just a tiny crack, just enough to peek. But what he saw standing there in the dark was not his great-grandmother or his great-grandfather. It was a huge green monster. On the evening of Wednesday, the 26th of March 2003, a 55-year-old woman named Linda Myers was driving her car down a quiet, 2-lane road in Darkey County, Ohio. Darkey County was the kind of place that was mostly made up of very small towns, separated by huge stretches of farmland. It was peaceful. As Linda drove, the sun was setting over a wide-open field, casting long shadows across the road. She was on her way home from the pizza shop that she and her husband Jack owned together in a nearby town. It was a normal end to a normal day. Eventually, Linda turned off the paved road and onto a long gravel driveway. This led to the sprawling 40-acre farm where she and Jack lived. She parked her car in front of their old farmhouse, a place that felt like home in every way. She reached into the back seat and grabbed the deposit bag. It was full of the cash earnings from the pizza shop for that day. She got out of the car, and the quiet of the countryside settled around her. The farm was so isolated that you couldn't hear any traffic from the main road. The only sounds were the sheep bleating softly in the pasture and the hum of power tools coming from the big barn out back. She walked around to the back of the barn, and there was Jack. He was hunched over the engine of a beat-up old car, tinkering away. Jack and Linda had been married for about 7 years. This was Linda's third marriage, but with Jack, she truly felt like she had found her soulmate. He was a hard worker. On top of co-owning the pizza shop with Linda, he also had a full-time job at a manufacturing plant. And, as if that wasn't enough, he ran a side business restoring classic cars. Linda often found him out here working on a car as the sun went down. It was just who he was. Sitting in the grass next to the car, playing with a small wrench, was Linda's 4-year-old great-grandson, Damien. The moment Damien saw Linda, his face lit up with a huge smile. He dropped the wrench, jumped to his feet, and ran over to give her a big, tight hug. Seeing Damien's happy face always made Linda feel a little bittersweet. Damien was the son of her granddaughter, Amber. But Amber had gotten pregnant when she was only 14 years old. She was just a child herself and wasn't in any position to raise a baby. So, Linda and Jack had stepped in. They offered to take Damien and raise him for a few years, just until Amber could finish high school and get her life on a stable track. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, and it came with its own set of problems. One of the biggest problems was Damien's father. He was furious about being cut out of the custody agreement and having limited access to his son. Even now, 4 years later, he still argued with Linda about it. He would insist that he wanted to be a part of Damien's life, but Linda was worried. She had a deep fear that he would eventually just abandon the boy, and she couldn't bear the thought of her great-grandson going through that kind of pain. So, she kept him at a distance. Besides, Linda thought Damien was going to have another father figure in his life very soon. In the past few years, Amber had really turned her life around. She had finished school, she had met a wonderful new man, and they had gotten married. Their plan was to take Damien in and raise him themselves as soon as he finished his current year of preschool, which was only a couple of months away. Linda was incredibly proud of Amber and how much she had matured. But she also felt a pang of sadness. She and Jack were going to miss having Damien around the farm. They loved him more than anything. In many ways, he was like their own son. Linda could see that Jack was completely focused on the car engine and probably didn't want to be interrupted. So she just said a quick hello to him, then scooped Damien up into her arms and carried him toward the farmhouse. She opened the back door, set Damien down inside, and told him to go wash his hands for dinner. Then she walked into the kitchen and tossed the deposit bag from the pizza shop onto a chair in the dining room. The bag was full of cash, and her plan was to take it to the bank first thing in the morning. Linda got a pan out and started cooking dinner. A few minutes later, her husband Jack came inside, his hands and arms covered in car grease. While Jack washed up at the kitchen sink, Linda asked him how his day had been. Jack just grumbled a bit. He was annoyed about a customer he'd sold a car to on a payment plan the year before. The customer had now missed 3 payments in a row. Jack said he was going to have to drive out to the guy's house the next day and repossess the car. Linda could tell Jack was tense, but she knew it wasn't just about the missed car payment. The truth was, Jack had been on edge for the past week or so. It all started after he had a huge argument with his 25-year-old son, Greg. Greg had always been a shy, mild-mannered kid who was really close with his dad. He had even been the best man at Jack and Linda's wedding. But recently, Greg's life seemed to be falling apart. He was going through a messy divorce, he was struggling with drinking and drug abuse, and he had been skipping shifts at his job. Earlier that month, Greg had come to the farm asking Jack for money. He said his house was about to be foreclosed on. But Jack had decided it was time for some tough love. He drew a line in the sand and said no. He told Greg that if he wanted to keep his house, he needed to clean up his act and get back to work. That conversation had turned into a massive fight. Now, Linda had a feeling that Jack was genuinely worried he had done permanent damage to his relationship with Greg. He was probably afraid that history was repeating itself. Something similar had happened with Jack's other son, Travis, about 7 years earlier. When Travis was 21, he and Jack had gotten into an argument that was so bad, Travis packed his bags, moved out, and they hadn't spoken a single word to each other since. 7 years of silence. Linda thought Jack must be terrified that the same thing was about to happen with Greg. So, while Jack stood at the sink, scrubbing the grease from his hands, Linda came up behind him and gently rubbed his shoulders. She told him not to worry so much about Greg. She said Greg had a good head on his shoulders and just needed a little push to get back on the right track. That's all Jack had done. She reassured him that he'd made the right decision and that Greg would get through this rough patch. After that, Linda set the table and called everyone for dinner. A little while later, after they had all eaten and cleaned up the kitchen, Linda glanced up at the clock. She realized it was getting pretty late. Damien had preschool in the morning, and she didn't want him to be tired and cranky. So she picked him up and carried him upstairs to his room to get him ready for bed. She helped him change into his pajamas, brushed his teeth for him, and then tucked him into his bed. She gave him a kiss on his forehead, whispered good night, and quietly closed the door behind her. Linda went back downstairs. Before long, she and Jack were getting ready for bed too. A short time later, Linda was in their bedroom. She had a small lamp on. She changed into her own pajamas and crawled under the covers. Once Jack was settled in beside her, she reached over and turned off the light, and the room went dark. Soon, they were both fast asleep. But several hours later, in the middle of the night, Linda was jolted awake by a horribly loud noise. She shot up in bed, her heart pounding. She looked around the dark room, trying to figure out what had happened. When her eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, she saw something that made her gasp. The next morning, at a church just a mile away from Linda and Jack's house, a preschool teacher was getting her classroom ready for the day. As the children started to arrive, she noticed there was one empty chair. One of her students, 4-year-old Damien Huffman, was late. This wasn't totally unusual. She knew Damien's great-grandparents were busy people. They ran a farm, a pizza shop, and a car restoration business. She figured they were probably just running a little behind schedule. So she started the class as usual, hoping they would drop Damien off before he missed too much of the day. About an hour later, around 9:30 in the morning, she was leading the class in their morning sing-alongs. Suddenly, the classroom door burst open and Damien came sprinting inside. At first, the teacher was just relieved to see him. But then she got a closer look. Damien looked frazzled and he was out of breath. He wasn't wearing his backpack. He was still in his pajamas. And there was a smear of something dark and brown on the front of his shirt. She immediately ran over to him and knelt down. As she got closer, she realized the brown spot on his shirt was dried blood. The teacher's heart sank. She gently asked Damien what was going on. He looked up at her with a scared and confused expression on his little face. He told her that his great-grandparents' faces were melting. About 15 minutes after that, a police sergeant named Mark Whitaker and his partner were driving their patrol car down a secluded road toward a farmhouse in rural Ohio. Sergeant Whitaker had been a detective with the Darker County Sheriff's Department for 5 years, and he was the head of the investigative unit. When the department got a very strange 911 call that morning from a local preschool, he was the one sent out to see what was going on. The preschool teacher on the phone had sounded frantic. She said a 4-year-old student named Damien Huffman had shown up for school alone, covered in what looked like blood, and was saying something bizarre about his great-grandparents' faces melting. The teacher gave the police the names of the great-grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, and their address. Whitaker had no idea what a 4-year-old boy could have meant by that strange phrase, or what kind of scene he and his partner were about to walk into, but he had a very bad feeling about it. They pulled up to the farm and parked at the end of the long gravel driveway. When Whitaker got out of his car, the first thing he noticed was how eerily quiet it was. There was another farmhouse just across the road and a few more scattered on the horizon, but otherwise they were surrounded by nothing but empty fields. It felt completely isolated. Whitaker started walking towards the front of the farmhouse. As he got closer, he saw that the front door was already wide open. He didn't see any obvious signs of a forced entry, like a kicked-in door or a broken lock, but it was still unsettling. Whitaker and his partner reflexively drew their weapons. They stepped carefully over the threshold and into the house. Whitaker called out, announcing their presence, asking if anyone was home. But there was no response. The only sound was the wind whistling through the open door. From where he was standing in the entryway, he could see another open door across the room. It led to a set of stairs going down, probably to a basement. Whitaker decided to ignore the basement for now and focus on clearing the main floor first. He and his partner moved cautiously through the house. They went into the kitchen. It was empty. Once they were sure it was clear, they continued down a hallway until they found a doorway that led into a bedroom. Whitaker pushed the door open and stepped inside. And that's when he found them. Damien's great-grandparents, Jack and Linda Myers, were lying in their bed side by side. It was obvious from the moment he saw them that they were both dead. Jack was lying on his stomach. Whitaker could immediately see a large dark wound on the back of Jack's neck. It looked like a bullet wound. Linda was lying on her back. She had gunshot wounds on her face and on her hand, as if she had raised her hand in a last desperate attempt to defend herself just before she was shot. At this point, Whitaker and his partner did a full, systematic search of the rest of the house just to make sure the killer wasn't still hiding somewhere inside. The house was empty. So the two of them returned to the master bedroom to begin the difficult task of processing the crime scene. Whitaker pulled on a pair of latex gloves and gently touched the wound on Linda's face. The blood was still warm and wet to the touch. Based on that, he figured they had likely only been dead for a few hours at most. He scanned the floor around the bed, looking for bullet casings. He couldn't find any. This told him something important. It meant the killer had been careful. They had taken the time to pick up the spent casings afterwards to cover their track. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned. Then, Whitaker's partner called his attention to something strange. There was a weird, plasticky bundle lying on a pillow near Jack's head. Whitaker carefully picked it up. It was a piece of quilting fabric that had been wadded up into a ball and then covered in layers of masking tape. He turned it over in his gloved hands. His best guess was that it was a homemade gun silencer. The killer had probably taped it to the end of their gun to try and muffle the sound of the gunshots. It must have been blown off when they started firing. This immediately raised a question in Whitaker's mind. If this was a silencer, why would a killer even need one? They were out here in the middle of nowhere. The nearest neighbors were far away, but then he remembered who else was in the house. He left the bedroom and went up a flight of stairs. The room directly above where the murders had taken place was another bedroom. This one was filled with stuffed animals and toy trucks. It was obviously Damien's room. And that's when it clicked for Whitaker. The killer must have known there was a toddler sleeping right upstairs. They needed the silencer because they didn't want to wake the child when they committed the murders. And this meant one thing for sure. The killer almost certainly knew Jack and Linda personally. This wasn't a random home invasion. This was personal. Within minutes, more officers from the Darke County Sheriff's Office arrived and began to swarm the property. Whitaker went back outside to supervise them as they set up a perimeter and started their search for evidence. Pretty quickly, a forensics officer called him over. They had found a set of footprints in the soft mud near the side of the house. Whitaker followed the trail of footprints, which led them around the side of the house to a small basement window. The window pane had been carefully pried off, leaving an open hole just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Whitaker crouched down and peered through the opening. Inside, he could see a set of stairs leading up to the main floor of the house. This had to be how the killer got inside. It also explained why that basement door had been standing wide open when they first entered the house. This discovery only made Whitaker more certain that the killer was someone close to the family. They obviously knew the layout of the house. Whitaker told the forensics officer to make a plaster cast of the footprints. With any luck, it would tell them the type and size of shoe the killer was wearing. As Whitaker stood back up, he noticed something else. The phone lines that ran along the side of the house had been cut. The wire was cleanly severed. The killer had planned this meticulously. They had made sure that no one inside the house would be able to call for help. Just then, a pickup truck pulled up at the end of the road. A woman got out and started walking hesitantly toward the house. Whitaker quickly walked over to intercept her, making sure she didn't get too close and contaminate the crime scene. He asked her what she needed. She explained that she was a neighbor who lived at the next property over. She said she had seen all the police cars and didn't know what was going on, but she thought she had some information that might be helpful. The neighbor told Whitaker that around 4:30 that morning, she had been awake and had seen a minivan leaving the Myers farm. It had been too dark for her to see the color of the minivan, but the vehicle itself had stuck out in her memory. As far as she knew, the Myers family did not own a minivan. Hearing this, Whitaker realized this woman may have seen the killer leaving the property. If that was true, it meant the murders most likely happened sometime before 4:30 in the morning. This was a potentially huge piece of the puzzle. He thanked the neighbor for her help. After she left, Whitaker went back inside the house to look for more clues. He really wanted to figure out a motive. He was convinced that whoever did this knew Jack and Linda, but that didn't explain why. Was it a robbery gone wrong? Was it revenge for some old grudge? He didn't know. As he walked through the house, he found that deposit bag full of cash that Linda had brought home. It was sitting in plain sight in the living room. It hadn't been touched. There were also some expensive electronics in the living room, a TV, and a stereo system that were also untouched. This pretty much ruled out robbery as a motive. So Whitaker went back upstairs to take another closer look at the toddler's bedroom. As he scanned the room, he noticed something odd. On the child's bedding, there was a small reddish-brown stain. It looked like a spot of dried blood. While forensics teams were still carefully combing over every inch of the farmhouse, another investigator on the case, a man named Detective Mike Burns, drove to the local preschool. His task was to speak with the only potential witness, 4-year-old Damien. Burns was a father himself, and he felt an immediate wave of sympathy for this little boy who was sitting in a small office looking scared and utterly confused. He knew it was going to be incredibly difficult for Damien to talk about something so traumatic, but he was their best hope of figuring out what had happened to his great-grandparents. Burns sat down on the floor with Damien in a private room. He spoke in a soft, calm voice and asked the little boy to try and explain what had happened that morning. Damien, in the simple way that a 4-year-old talks, said he had woken up around 8:45. The house was very, very quiet. So he got out of his bed and went into his great-grandparents' bedroom. He said they were both in their bed, and at first, he just thought they were sleeping. But when he tried to wake them up, they wouldn't move. Then he saw that there was blood on their faces. He said he tried to wipe the blood off with some Kleenex wipes, but there was just so much of it. He realized then that something was very, very wrong. He said he thought for a moment that their faces were melting. And so, thinking he needed to get help for them, he had run the entire mile down the road to his preschool. Burns was amazed that a child so young could remember and articulate so much about such a horrifying experience. He was also grateful. The boy's story explained why there was blood on his pajama shirt. But it still didn't explain the small spot of blood they'd found on Damien's own bed. So, Burns asked Damien if he had gone back into his own room at any point after finding his great-grandparents. But Damien shook his head and said no. He said he went straight out the front door and ran to his school. Burns felt like there had to be more to the story. He just couldn't explain how that bloodstain got onto Damien's bed. So, he brought over a dollhouse and some small toy figures. He asked Damien if he could act out everything that had happened the night before, using the toys to represent himself and his great-grandparents. Damien took the toy that represented himself and put it into a bed in one of the dollhouse rooms. Then he put the Jack and Linda toys into the bed in the other room. He said that everybody went to sleep at their normal bedtime. But then, he said, later, in the middle of the night, he heard his bedroom door open. He said somebody came inside. Burns asked Damien who it was. Damien paused for a long moment, and then he said, "The green monster." At first, Burns wasn't sure what to make of this. He wondered if Damien was just describing a nightmare or if his imagination was running wild. But then, Damien put the toys down. To represent the green monster, he used his fingers, and he made them crawl across the floor of the dollhouse, moving slowly toward his own bed. Damien explained that he had heard the door to his room open, and he had opened his eyes just a tiny bit. He didn't want whoever it was to know he was awake, so he was just squinting. And when he did that, he saw the green monster standing right next to his bed, and the green monster was pointing a gun at him. Damien said he was so scared that he squeezed his eyes shut as tight as he could and just pretended to be asleep. And then, when he finally dared to open his eyes again, the green monster was gone. After hearing this, Burns realized that Damien's memory was almost certainly not a dream. It was all too real. More than likely, Damien had come face to face with the person who killed his great-grandparents. They were the green monster. After leaving the preschool, the next priority for Detective Burns was to speak to Damien's mother, a 19-year-old named Amber Holscher. So, the detective drove out to Amber's house in a nearby town. When he rang the doorbell, she answered right away. At this point, no one in the family had been officially notified about the murders, so Amber had no idea why a detective was suddenly standing on her doorstep. Burns knew this would be difficult, so he gently asked if he could come inside to speak with her. Confused, Amber said, "Okay," and let him in. They sat down in her living room. Then Burns told her as gently as he could that her grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, were no longer with them. When Amber heard this, she just looked confused. She asked what he meant. "Where are they?" she asked. Burns took a deep breath and had to clarify that they were deceased. Amber looked completely shocked. Her eyes filled with tears, and the first thing she asked was, "Is Damien dead too?" But Burns quickly reassured her. He told her that Damien was alive and safe, but that he was going to be kept in protective custody for a while. They were worried that whoever killed Jack and Linda might try to hurt Damien too. And until they had a suspect, Damien would not be allowed to see anyone in the family, including her, his own mother. At this point, Amber just broke down and started to cry. Burns felt terrible for her, but his main focus was on Damien. He knew he had to solve this case as quickly as possible. Every day that went by was another day that Damien would have to spend alone without any family to comfort him. Based on Amber's genuine shock and her immediate concern for her son, Burns felt it was highly unlikely that she was involved. Damien also hadn't mentioned seeing his mother at the farmhouse, but she might know something that could help them. Once she had calmed down a bit, Burns asked her if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt her grandparents. Right away, she nodded. She mentioned Damien's father, Andrew Huffman. She said Andrew hated Linda because Linda wouldn't let him see Damien. In fact, she said, just recently, Andrew had shown up at Linda's pizza shop and had started a big fight with her about custody. The argument had gotten so heated that Andrew had publicly threatened to kill Linda. This immediately caught Burns's attention. It provided a clear and powerful motive. If Linda and Jack were out of the way, Andrew would have a much easier time getting custody of Damien, so he thanked Amber for her help and promised he would be in touch soon. The moment he got back to his car, he called Sergeant Whitaker and told him what he had learned. Later that day, Whitaker and his partner made the 2-hour drive to Andrew's address in Newport, Kentucky. When they got there, Andrew came to the door and let them inside. He sat down and looked at them, waiting for them to explain why they were there. They told him that Linda and Jack had been murdered, and they watched his reaction very closely. He seemed surprised, but he definitely did not seem upset or sad. Andrew openly admitted that he did not get along with Amber's family. And when Whitaker asked him about the big argument at the pizza shop, Andrew didn't deny it. He admitted that he had, in fact, threatened to kill Linda. But he swore he would never actually do something like that. He said it was just an empty threat made in the heat of the moment. Still, Whitaker thought Andrew seemed very suspicious. So, he asked him for an alibi for the night of the murders. Andrew said he had stayed over at a girl's house that night. In the morning, he had stopped by his dad's house, and then he had gone straight to work. He told them they could ask all of those people, and they would all confirm his story. Whitaker wrote all of this down. He asked Andrew a few more questions, and then thanked him for his time. As soon as the detectives left Andrew's house, they immediately went to go check on his alibi. They drove to the girlfriend's house. Then they went to Andrew's dad's house. And finally, they went to his place of work. And every single person at all 3 locations confirmed Andrew's story. His alibi was solid. Unless all of them were lying, there was simply no window of time where Andrew could have driven 2 hours to Ohio, murdered Jack and Linda, and then driven back. Whitaker was disappointed. They had basically wasted most of the day chasing a lead that now looked like a dead end. And he was very aware that every moment this case went unsolved was another moment that little Damien had to spend all alone away from his family. The following morning, Detective Burns, the same officer who had spoken to Damien and his mother, was sitting in his office feeling very frustrated. He had one main goal for the day. He wanted to find and interview Jack's estranged son, 28-year-old Travis Myers. But it was proving to be much harder than he had anticipated. The day before, other sheriff's deputies had interviewed Linda and Jack's family and friends. Several family members had mentioned that Travis and his father Jack had some very bad blood between them. When Burns had looked into Travis's background, he found that Travis also had a criminal record. But there was a big problem. It seemed like Travis hadn't even been in the state of Ohio for the last 7 years. The last anyone in the family had heard, he had moved to Arizona to live with his mother. But when Burns had called the mother that morning, she said that she actually had no idea where Travis was. There was no other address on record for him. So, Burns basically had no way of finding him. He decided his best bet was to start by visiting Travis's younger brother, Greg. Burns knew Greg lived only a few towns over, and even though he wasn't sure how close the two brothers were, it was the only lead he had. A little while later, Burns showed up at Greg's house and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a young man in a baseball cap opened the door. It was clear from his red, swollen eyes that he had been crying. Burns asked if he was Greg Myers. The young man nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Greg didn't seem surprised by the visit at all. He said the police had already called him the night before to tell him about his father and stepmother's murders. He said that since then, he'd just been waiting for an officer to come by and talk to him. He said he'd seen enough TV shows to know that family members were always the first suspects. But as they walked into the living room, Burns stopped in his tracks. There was another young man standing in the doorway, and he looked a lot like Greg. Burns asked who it was. Greg said, "Oh, that's my brother Travis." Burns couldn't believe his luck. He had come here hoping to maybe get a lead on where Travis might be. He never imagined he would just find Travis standing right there in Greg's house. This was a huge development. Until this moment, Burns had no idea if Travis was even in the state at the time of the murders. But Greg explained that Travis had actually been in Ohio for the past several weeks. He had been staying in an apartment he had rented nearby. Burns thought the timing of this seemed incredibly suspicious. It was just too convenient that Travis had come back to town for the first time in almost a decade, right before his estranged father and stepmother were killed. It just seemed too perfect. And something about the scene just felt off. The two brothers just standing there waiting for the police to come and question them. It didn't sit right with him. So Burns, acting on a gut instinct, told them both that he needed to question them formally. He said they would have to come with him down to the station. Less than an hour later, Detective Burns led Greg and Travis Myers into the Darke County Sheriff's Office. Neither of the brothers was under arrest yet, but Burns had a strong feeling that by the end of their interviews, one or both of them might be. Burns took Greg into his office for questioning, while his partner took Travis into an interview room down the hall. As soon as Greg sat down, Burns noticed that he wasn't making any eye contact. He was fidgeting and acting shifty. But Greg quickly said that he was perfectly willing to tell the detectives anything they wanted to know if it could help them solve his dad and stepmother's murders. So Burns began asking questions. He asked Greg where he was in the early hours of Thursday morning when Jack and Linda were killed. Greg told him that he was mostly just asleep. That is, until about 4:30, when he got up to go to his job at a factory a few towns over. He also said his girlfriend was at home with him the entire night, and she could confirm that. He then said he drove to work in his minivan. He clocked in at 5:23 in the morning, and he even had a signed time card at home that would prove it. Burns was immediately very interested to learn that Greg drove a minivan. Remember, the neighbor had said she saw a minivan leaving the Myers farm around 4:30 that morning, suggesting the killer drove a minivan. However, Burns was starting to realize that even if Greg's alibi was a little shaky, the timing alone seemed to rule him out. It seemed basically impossible to drive from Greg's house at 4:30, go all the way to the farm, commit the murders, then drive all the way to the factory, and still be able to clock in by 5:23. There just didn't seem to be enough time to do all of that. Also, pretty much everyone in the family had told Burns that Greg was actually quite close with Jack and Linda. Yes, he was having some problems with drugs and alcohol, but he had no history of crime or violence, and none of his family members thought he seemed capable of being a killer. So, even though Greg was still technically a suspect, Burns decided to shift his focus to Travis. Burns asked Greg how Travis had reacted when he heard about the murders. Greg said Travis had been upset, but he had mostly been concerned about how Greg was coping, since Greg was the one who was much closer to Jack and Linda. Greg went on to say that it had been at least 7 years since Travis and his father had spoken. He said those two did not get along at all. Burns asked Greg about that big falling out between Jack and Travis. Greg said it all came down to business disagreements on the farm. He said Travis had felt like his father was cheating him out of money. They had a huge argument that got really ugly. After that, Travis had just quit the family business and moved away. Burns thought about this. He wondered if maybe Travis stood to inherit any money if his father died. Because if he did, that would certainly be a solid motive for murder. So, Burns made 2 mental notes. First, check into Greg's alibi more thoroughly. And second, look into Jack's will to see how his assets were supposed to be divided up. After that, he thanked Greg for his cooperation, told him to wait in his office, and then Burns left. He went right down the hall and waited outside the room where his partner was questioning Travis. Later, Burns's partner told him that Travis had seemed really nervous from the moment he stepped into the room. The detective had asked him what he was doing back in Ohio. Travis said he'd just been reevaluating his life recently and realized he had never actually met his brother Greg's children. So, he'd come back to Ohio to do just that and spend some time with them. Then, the detective asked him what he was doing at the time Jack and Linda were killed. Travis stuttered and said he was sleeping in his apartment. The detective asked if he had anyone who could confirm that. Travis hesitated for a moment and then shook his head and said no. Then the detective asked Travis if he had a car. Travis said that at the moment he was driving his mother's car. It was a white minivan. After getting the summary from his partner, Burns went back to his office. By this point, Greg had been moved to a different room. Burns sat down at his desk and began going over the evidence they had collected so far. The investigation had been moving very quickly, so there actually wasn't a whole lot of physical evidence processed yet. It had only been 24 hours since the forensic evidence had been sent to the crime lab, so they were still waiting for results on just about everything. Burns knew that at this point, the best thing he could do while he waited was to follow up on Travis and Greg's alibis. They were the victim's sons, he already believed the killer was close to the family, and they both drove minivans. Really, either of them could be the killer. But just then, Burns's office phone rang. He picked it up. It was a local man who said he had seen a news report about the murders of Jack and Linda Myers. And he had some information that he thought might help. The man said that a few days earlier, a friend of his had called him to ask if he knew where they could buy a gun. And when this man asked his friend why he needed a gun, the friend said it was because he, quote, wanted to shoot Jack Myers. The man on the phone told Burns the name of his friend who had said this, and as soon as Burns heard that name, he knew exactly who the murderer was. Based on that crucial phone call, as well as the forensic evidence from the crime scene, this is what police believe happened to Jack and Linda Myers on the morning of the 27th of March 2003. Early that morning, the killer woke up, got out of bed, and immediately put on a green hunting jumpsuit. They also packed a bag with duct tape, trash bags, and a roll of masking tape. Then they put on a pair of latex gloves and loaded the 12-gauge shotgun they had purchased from a classified ad just 2 days earlier. They carried all of their supplies out to their minivan. After they were ready, they hopped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove a familiar route through the dark, open fields of the countryside. They were calm at first, but as they turned onto the long gravel road that led to Jack and Linda's farm, their heart began to race. The killer felt like they had planned everything out perfectly and had prepared for anything that could possibly go wrong. So now, all they had to do was control their nerves and stick to the plan. The killer parked right outside the farmhouse. Then, while still sitting in the car, they climbed into the backseat of the minivan and grabbed their shotgun. They took a piece of thick quilting fabric, wrapped it around the barrel of the shotgun, and used masking tape to secure it in place. This was their do-it-yourself silencer. But as they did this, the killer's hands were shaking. They were nervous. As much as they had planned for this moment, it really wasn't something they wanted to do. But they felt like they had to. After their gun had its silencer, they slung it over their shoulder. They got out of the van and crept around to the side of the house. Once they were there, they cut the phone lines, making sure nobody inside could call for help. Then they knelt down in the dirt, pried open the basement window, and climbed inside. Once inside the dark basement, the killer walked to the stairs. They went up to the first floor and walked straight to the bedroom where they knew Jack and Linda would be asleep. They went inside. There they were, sleeping in their bed. The killer took a deep breath and then raised the shotgun. They fired a single round into the back of Jack's neck. But the force of the gunshot was too strong for the homemade silencer. It blew right off. So the shot wasn't silent at all. It was extremely loud. The silencer landed on the pillow right next to Jack's head. From the chaos, Linda sat bolt upright in bed. She looked straight at the killer and saw what was happening. She instinctively raised a hand to try and defend herself. In a moment of sheer panic, the killer just turned the shotgun on her. They fired twice. One blast went through her hand. The other struck her right in the face. At this point, the killer just paused and listened. The silencer had sort of muffled the first shot, but the next two were incredibly loud. They knew that noise easily could have woken up the third person they knew was in the house. A person they really didn't want to hurt. But if they had to, they would. So, just to make sure there were no loose ends, they left Linda in Jack's bedroom, confident they were dead, and they crept upstairs to little Damien's room. They went inside, carefully walked over to the boy's bed, raised their shotgun, and aimed it at the child, waiting to see if he was awake. But the little boy appeared to be sound asleep. And so, the killer spared him. They lowered their shotgun and backed out of the room. Once they were back in the hallway, they shut Damien's door and hurried right out of the house. From there, they got back in their minivan and sped off into the darkness. A few miles away, they stopped on a bridge and tossed their gun, their supplies, and their bloody clothes into a river. Then they changed into their work clothes and drove to the factory, where they clocked in at precisely 5:23 in the morning. The killer was Jack's younger son, Greg Myers. Greg had been having serious problems with money and drug abuse. His father, Jack, had refused to bail him out, and they had been fighting about it. Greg knew that he would inherit the farm if his father died. And he was so desperate, he decided that murder was his only option. When police timed the drive from Jack and Linda's farm to Greg's workplace, they found that he would have had just enough time to commit the horrible double murder and then drive straight to work and clock in by 5:23. His alibi was just barely possible. Greg was arrested about 48 hours after the crime. The investigation moved so quickly that police were still gathering evidence to use against him even after he was in custody. They later found the shotgun, the other supplies, and a pair of shoes that matched the prints found in the mud outside the house, all in a river right near the farm. Fingerprints and store receipts tied all of the items back to Greg. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Damien, following the murders, he went to live with his mother Amber. Despite everything he witnessed at just 4 years old, Amber said in a 2021 documentary that he is now grown up and doing very well. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Sometimes reality is far more unpredictable and unsettling than any fiction we could write. We like to think we have a firm grip on our lives, that our spaces are safe, and that the people around us are exactly who they claim to be. But every now and then, a series of events shatters that illusion. Today, we're going to look at 3 different stories that show just how fragile our understanding of the world really is. In one case, a man lives for decades unaware of a danger lurking in his chest. In another, a brilliant mind gets caught up in international espionage, ending up in a situation so bizarre investigators still argue about it today. And in our final story, a normal afternoon turns into a struggle for survival, where tragic miscommunications lead to a heartbreaking end. These stories remind us that danger, mystery, and the unimaginable are often hiding just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Let's start in 2013 with a 46-year-old man named Paul Baxter. Paul was an ordinary guy who lived a relatively quiet life, but one day he started feeling a little under the weather. It began with a slight tickle, but over a couple of days it escalated into a massive cough. This wasn't a normal cold. It was a deep, chest-racking cough that became so constant, Paul could barely speak. Every time he tried to form a sentence, he would descend into another fit of coughing. Seeing that this was not getting any better, Paul decided to go see his doctor. The doctor listened to Paul's chest, heard the congestion, and quickly diagnosed him with pneumonia. This seemed like a very logical explanation, so the doctor put Paul on a treatment plan, which included a course of antibiotics and some rest. But after several months of being on this plan and not having his condition improve at all, his doctor referred him to a respiratory clinic. At the clinic, the specialists did an X-ray of his chest, and they discovered a suspicious shadow in the lower right section of his lung. Doctors were concerned, especially given the fact that Paul was a long-term smoker. They worried it could be cancer, but before they put him under the knife to cut this shadow out, they decided they would take a probe with a camera on the end of it, feed it down into his lungs, and actually have a look around inside. During the procedure, which Paul was awake for, the doctor put the probe down into that shadow area in his lung, and right away he saw a distinct lump. But when he zoomed in with his camera on the lump itself, he saw there was something orange sticking out of it. He told Paul there were little pincers at the end of this probe, and he was going to try to move the tissue around to see what this thing was, and if it was a foreign object, he would try to pull it out. But when he tried to move the tissue to get a better look, he couldn't get it dislodged, so he pulled the probe out and told Paul he would need to come back in a couple of days. Paul looked at the doctor, completely bewildered, and asked what that orange thing inside of his lung could possibly be. The doctor said he honestly had no idea, but it was definitely not supposed to be in there. A few days later, Paul went back in for this follow-up procedure. The doctor, using a longer and more powerful probe, was able to go down and actually dislodge this orange thing from inside of his lung. As soon as he pulled it free, everyone in the room watched the camera screen in real time. It was a small, triangular orange thing that nobody recognized. Finally, the pincers came out of Paul's mouth, revealing what it was holding on to, and nobody could believe what they were looking at. It was a small, plastic, orange traffic cone from a child's play toy set. As soon as Paul saw it, a memory came rushing back to him. He told the doctors that when he was 7 years old, he had inhaled a tiny toy traffic cone, but he thought he had swallowed it. Somehow, for over 40 years, he had lived with no symptoms at all, until his body finally reacted to it. Paul said that when he had this sudden revelation in front of the doctors, there was a moment of silence, and then everybody just started cracking up laughing. None of the doctors had ever seen anything like it before. Paul was allowed to keep his tiny orange traffic cone, and after he left, his cough went away and he went back to normal. But the problem was, how could someone live with plastic in their lung for over 40 years without noticing? The specialists realized that because Paul was so young, his airway adapted to the plastic. Tissue grew around it, forming a lump that kept it isolated. It was only when he grew older and his lungs changed from smoking that the tissue became irritated, triggering the cough that led to the discovery. Our second story takes us to the United Kingdom, and it involves a man named Gareth Williams. From the time Gareth was a young boy, his parents knew he was extremely gifted. When he was just 17 years old, he achieved a first-class honors mathematics degree from a university in his hometown of Wales. A couple of years after that, he had his PhD from the University of Manchester in England, and after that, he was accepted into a postgraduate course at Cambridge. But he wouldn't finish that degree because his incredible academic achievements had got the attention of Britain's intelligence agencies. In 2001, when Gareth was 23, GCHQ, which is one of Britain's main intelligence agencies, offered him a job as a codebreaker. He eagerly accepted, dropped out of Cambridge, and moved into a modest apartment in Cheltenham, where GCHQ is located. There, he would live and work for the next 10 years. Gareth was an intensely private and shy person, but he was a highly valued team player whose genius helped his group win several top awards. In 2009, Britain's famous secret intelligence service, MI6, was so impressed with Gareth that they offered him a job. This was a rare chance for Gareth to go operational and become a real-life spy. He jumped at the chance, but shortly after moving to London, he regretted his decision. He absolutely hated the intense competitiveness within MI6, the flashy cars, the flashy lifestyles, and the pressure to go out and party with your coworkers every weekend. Gareth just wanted to do his job and then be left alone. At GCHQ, nobody cared that he was quiet, but at MI6, this behavior made him an outsider. He eventually decided to transfer back to GCHQ, but before he left, he took his annual 2-week vacation. But when the vacation was over, he didn't come back to work at his office in London, and for some reason, MI6 never checked in on him to see where he was. It wasn't until his sister called police after not hearing from him that anyone looked into his disappearance. On August 23rd, a uniformed officer went to Gareth's apartment in London to do a welfare check. After knocking on the door and not getting an answer, the officer got the key from the landlord and went inside. He yelled out for Gareth, but there was no sign of him on the first floor. He went upstairs, still calling for him. When he got to the second floor, he found a closed bathroom door. What he found on the other side of that door would make international headlines for weeks. When he opened the door, he walked into a bathroom, and in the bathtub, there was a big red zippered duffel bag. Inside of that duffel bag was the badly decomposed body of Gareth Williams. The zipper of the bag was padlocked shut on the outside, and the key to this padlock was lying directly underneath Gareth's body inside of the bag. There were absolutely no fingerprints anywhere in the bathtub, on the bag itself, on the zippers, on the padlock, or on the keys. Gareth's iPhone had been found nearby on a table, and it had been completely reset to factory settings. Investigators would later determine that his phone had been reset on August 15th, which was the last day Gareth was seen on street security cameras, and also the day they believe he died. According to the coroner, Gareth's body had no injuries on it, there was no sign of a struggle, and his toxicology report showed no drugs or alcohol in his system. But the thermostat inside the apartment was turned way up, making it extremely hot inside despite it being the height of summer in August. This excessive heat sped up the decomposition process, which made it impossible for the coroner to precisely determine a cause of death. Despite a lengthy investigation by police, there was never a conclusive determination as to what happened to Gareth, although there are many theories. Some say the Russian mafia killed him because right before he died, he had been focusing on money laundering in Britain that was tied to the Russian mob, which would have made him a target. Another theory is that MI6 had something to do with Gareth's death, which is why they were not so eager to go looking for him when he didn't come back from his vacation. In fact, one former MI6 agent believed there was a cover-up. He stated that it looked like MI6 had gone into Gareth's apartment ahead of the police and wiped it down, removing all fingerprints and DNA. The last prominent theory is that Gareth did this to himself. It was discovered that he made occasional online visits to bondage sites, and at least once he had to yell out to his landlord to help get him out of his bed because he had tied his wrist to the bed frame and couldn't get himself undone. But when two experts who were a part of the investigation attempted to put themselves inside of a similar-sized duffel bag and lock it with the padlock on the outside, they couldn't do it, despite trying over 400 times. And even if Gareth could have somehow physically got himself inside of this bag and locked it from the outside, how could he have done that without leaving fingerprints all over the bag, the lock, the zippers, or the tub? When he was found, he didn't have gloves on. Ultimately, despite the massive red flags, Gareth's death was determined to be probably an accident, and the case was closed 3 years after his body was found. But for his family, the unanswered questions still linger. They have always maintained that a brilliant mind like Gareth, who was working on highly sensitive international security operations, was likely targeted by professionals who knew exactly how to make a murder look like an impossible self-inflicted accident. On the afternoon of April 10, 2018, 16-year-old Kyle Plush had just finished classes at Seven Hills High School in Cincinnati, Ohio. He walked out the school's doors and began walking straight across towards the sophomore parking lot where his car, a gold Honda Odyssey minivan, was located. Although Kyle had suffered a spinal cord injury at a young age, he made a remarkable recovery. He ran, biked, swam, and played soccer. But tennis was his favorite. He had joined the high school tennis team and become one of their best players. That afternoon, he had a match scheduled, so he needed to get into his minivan and get out his tennis racket and his tennis shoes. He made it to the vehicle a little bit after 3 in the afternoon, slid open the door, threw his backpack inside, and then climbed toward the third row seat of the van where his sneakers were sitting. He got to the third row, turned around, and sat down facing the front of the minivan. He took off his school shoes, put on his tennis shoes, and then he got up onto his knees and turned around so he was facing the back of the van. His knees were on the third row seat, and he began reaching down into the trunk well to reach for his bag that contained his tennis racket. As he was reaching, the third row seat itself, which he was kneeling on, suddenly flipped backwards, dumping him headfirst into the trunk. Except all of Kyle's body did not just go tumbling into the trunk space. Tinma, his upper half, made it about halfway down, and then he got stuck upside down when the top of that heavy third row seat caught his chest and pressed it tightly up against the back hatch of the van. Kyle was completely upside down, and his hands were free in the trunk space, but they were too close to the floor where he couldn't really press himself out of this position. This third row seat had come loose, and because it was not locked in position, if he tried to move up at all, the seat went with him, and if he came down, the seat came with him too. Even trying to push himself back out again was impossible because he couldn't clear the seat. He probably looked for places to pull himself down, hoping that might be a way to clear the obstruction, but there was nothing to grab onto, and his lower half would not have been able to slip through that gap, even if the seat was stationary. No person is supposed to get through that tiny little gap, and there was also no inside handle on the back hatch that Kyle could have grabbed to potentially open the door. He was entirely reliant on somebody showing up and opening the trunk from the outside. But the scariest part of this situation was that loose third row seat weighed nearly 100 pounds, and it was driving directly against his chest, crushing his lungs with every passing second. He would have had to fight with every single breath he took, pushing up against that 100 pounds just to get a marginal gasp of air. Worse than that, if Kyle didn't constantly put air into his chest and keep it full and strong, that seat would literally crush his chest and kill him. Kyle knew he had to find a way to signal someone that he was in this car. He couldn't reach his phone because it was up in his pants pocket, and trying to reach it meant getting around the seat, which he couldn't do. But he had a smartphone, and he knew he could use voice-assisted calling. At 3:14 in the afternoon, he used his iPhone's voice assistant, Siri, to call 911. As soon as the dispatcher picked up, Kyle was frantic, yelling for help, saying he was trapped in a minivan in the Seven Hills parking lot and someone needed to get him out. But the dispatcher couldn't really understand what Kyle was saying because he was yelling from deep inside the trunk space up to his phone in his pocket. The dispatcher was just having a hard time understanding him, although if you listen to the audio, it is plainly clear that Kyle is in extreme distress. You can hear him yelling and you can hear him banging on the inside of the car. The dispatcher kept asking where he was, but Kyle couldn't hear his phone, so he just kept frantically repeating his situation, saying his name, where he was located, and what was happening to him, hoping that someone on the other end of the line would understand and come save him. Toward the end of the call, Kyle tells the dispatcher that he thinks he is going to die here, and when the call cuts out, the dispatcher tries calling back, but it goes straight to voicemail. The voicemail only indicated his name was Kyle. Not knowing if this was real or a hoax, the dispatcher wrongly labeled the call as unknown trouble when they broadcasted it to the police, and they did not communicate that the caller was obviously in distress, screaming and banging. Had the dispatcher given Kyle's call a higher priority, fire and rescue would have been alerted, and they could have used their advanced mapping technologies to pinpoint where his cell phone was. Instead, local police were sent to the Seven Hills High School area to look around the different parking lots. But there was nearly a dozen of these parking lots associated with the school, making it a huge search area. And again, these police officers were not even aware of what they were looking for. They were looking for unknown trouble associated with some caller somewhere around this huge high school. The police showed up and began kind of meandering through the parking lots, staying inside their patrol vehicles and just looking around. They didn't see any obvious problems, although in reality, they were right near Kyle's gold minivan the entire time. At 3:35, with the police still patrolling the parking lots, Kyle used Siri to call 911 again, and a different dispatcher answered. At this point, it had been 21 minutes since his first call, and the weight of that heavy seat was becoming unbearable. His voice was very weak and faint. You can tell he had highly labored breathing, and every word was punctuated with a long silence as he tried to get out anything he could to help himself. He told the dispatcher, "If I die, I need you to tell my mother that I love her." There was a long silence, and Kyle asked them if they could hear him. He told them this was not a joke, that he was trapped in his gold minivan in the Seven Hills sophomore parking lot, and if they didn't get there soon, he was going to die. He kept saying, hey Siri," trying to keep the phone active, but then it went completely silent. The second dispatcher heard Kyle on this call, but for some reason did not relay to the patrolling officers Kyle's dire situation or his exact position. They didn't tell the officers that he was in a gold Honda Odyssey in the sophomore parking lot. That critical information was never communicated, and so just 2 minutes after the second call ended, the officers left the school thinking there was no trouble. Kyle was left entirely alone in the dark. 6 hours later, Kyle's father went out looking for him after he didn't come home from his tennis match. He used an iPad tracking application to locate his son's phone, which pointed him directly to the school. He drove there and found the gold minivan parked in the sophomore parking lot. But when he ran up and opened the vehicle, it was already too late. His son was still trapped upside down in the trunk space, and he had passed away after the heavy seat finally crushed his chest, causing him to asphyxiate. The medical examiner later confirmed that the heavy seat had slowly compressed his chest, preventing him from breathing, and he had died of positional asphyxiation. Kyle's family was absolutely devastated by the tragic loss of their son, and they filed a major wrongful death lawsuit against the city of Cincinnati and several employees involved. They sought to ensure that such a catastrophic breakdown in the emergency system would never happen to another family again. The legal proceedings and the fight for accountability would continue for years, leaving a deep, lingering sadness over the entire high school community and a tragic, permanent reminder of how a series of small, avoidable human errors can lead to the loss of an extraordinary young life filled with so much potential. Some mysteries eventually get answers. Others never do. And of the 3 stories you heard today, at least one still leaves more questions than answers. If stories like these fascinate you, there's another unbelievable true case waiting in the next video. Go check it out and see if you can figure that one out before the experts did. Kenika Jenkins, who was 19 years old at the time, was getting ready to make plans to go out with her friends on the evening of Friday, the 8th of September, 2017. She was going to go out with her pals. It was the kind of night that seemed to be full with potential that had not yet been realized. The kind of night that many of us remember from when we were that age. An invitation to a birthday party had been made to Kenika and her 3 friends, and it was not any ordinary party of any type. Kenika and her friends have been invited to attend. The Crowne Plaza Chicago O'Hare Hotel, which had an aura of refinement and a touch of glitz, was the location of the event that was being conducted. They were all overjoyed and happy. To get to the hotel, which was located in the neighborhood of Rosemont and was in close proximity to the airport, they got into their vehicle and drove there. The hotel was located in Rosemont. While they were driving, they were laughing and talking about the night that was going to come, and the lights of Chicago offered a backdrop that was familiar to them. Around 11 o'clock on that particular evening, they arrived at the parking lot of the hotel where they were staying. As soon as they discovered a parking spot, they got out of the van and made their way into the lobby of the Crowne Plaza, which was a well-lit area. If we were to claim that the atmosphere was typical of a hotel that was filled on a Friday night, we would be understating the situation. In addition to checking in and going to the bar, there was a steady stream of individuals coming and going during the whole day. The group of friends that Kenika was with made their way to the elevator and then proceeded to rise to the 9th floor before arriving at their destination. Room 926 was the location where the event was held. As soon as they opened the door to the room where they were staying, the celebration had already begun in full swing. There were a significant number of people, including friends and friends of friends, who were jammed into the small hotel room despite its limited space. At the same time that people were dancing and the music was playing at a loud volume, beverages were freely passed from one person to another. As they had anticipated, the setting was brimming with life and vitality, which was exactly what they had brought with them. Kenika and her friends joined in very quickly when the news broke. There was a whirlwind of music, laughter, and conversation, and the hours began to blend together and became less distinct as the conversation continued. When Kenika arrived at the party, she was drinking, much like a large number of other individuals who were there. As the night went, it became increasingly apparent to a few of the other individuals who were attending the party that she was becoming quite intoxicated. This was the case since she was getting more and more drunk. At one point, when they attempted to give Kenika a hug, they discovered that she was so unsteady on her feet that she was unable to stand up on her own. Later on, a witness who was present at the moment provided this information to the detectives who were conducting the investigation. Another witness recalled seeing Kenika after some time had passed, and they both recalled seeing her. While the most of the people were standing up and dancing around in reaction to the music, Kenika was sitting on the edge of the bed, which was situated off to the side. Kenika was taking a seat on the edge of the bed. It appeared as though she lacked the stamina and coordination required to even stand up, let alone dance, based on the manner in which she held herself. The mere act of sitting there gave the impression that she was unable to deal with the quantity of alcohol that she had ingested. It has been a couple of hours since that earlier time. It was sometime about 3 o'clock in the morning when the event took place. The celebration was beginning to wind down when Kanika and the three friends that she had brought with her to the party came to the conclusion that it was time to call it a night and head back home, despite the fact that they had been celebrating for quite some time. After saying their goodbyes to one another, the two of them made their way through the bustling area and then exited onto the corridor on the 9th level, which was quite calm on that level. As the four of them made their way down the lengthy corridor in the direction of the elevators, the hotel's security cameras would eventually record them as they made their way down the corridor. After a long night out, they gave the impression of being any other group of young people that they could have been of any other age. All the way down to the ground floor where they exited the elevator, they were transported by the elevator, which brought them all the way down. Following their departure from the building, they entered the main lobby, which had grown noticeably less boisterous in comparison to the time when they had initially arrived. Just as they were beginning to make their way towards the main door, Kanika suddenly came to a complete and utter halt. She had the intention of heading out to the parking lot and locating their vehicle. At first, she was checking her pockets, and then she checked her handbag. She was getting ready to leave. When she gazed at her face, she gave off the impression of being confused. Nevertheless, she was devoid of the keys to her vehicle. In addition to that, she was unable to place her cell phone anywhere in the vicinity. She took the time to explain to her pals that she must have overlooked the people who were still present in the establishment. They were able to establish control of the situation, despite the fact that Kanika was substantially more intoxicated than her friends were at the time. When they shifted their attention to Kanika, it was clear that she was having trouble standing and keeping her head in an upright position. They told her to come to a stop and wait in this location. Ensure that you continue to be present in this very lobby. We will have to return to room 926 inches in order to find your stuff for you. We apologize for the inconvenience. At first glance, it seemed like a basic approach. The moment Kanika gave a little nod, her companions turned around and headed back in the direction of the elevators, leaving her to be by herself in the lobby. The group of her friends returned to the party room, which was situated on the second story of the building. First, they spent a few minutes searching the disorganized room for her pocketbook, and then they finally found it. On the other hand, they were not successful in their exploration. Both her cell phone and one of her keys were discovered inside the house. It was clear that they had been successful in achieving their goals. After leaving the party for the second time, they ultimately made their way back down to the lobby in order to meet up with Kanika. They did this with a sense of relief before leaving the party. Nevertheless, there were no people present in the foyer upon the opening of the elevator doors and their departure from the elevator, because he was no longer present. They looked around, considering the likelihood that she had most likely just gone outside to get some fresh air. They were thinking about this possibility. Upon exiting the primary door, they proceeded to explore the surrounding region and take in their surroundings. It is not true, she was not there. Currently, it seemed as though they were not really concerned about the situation. After some consideration, they arrived at the conclusion that she must have become exhausted from waiting, and as a result, she ultimately chose to walk out to the car by herself. The three of them began going through the parking lot till they found their vehicle. This was done in order to locate their automobile. Nevertheless, Kanika was not there when they got at the area where they were waiting. In addition to the fact that she was not inside the vehicle, she was also not standing in any geographical vicinity to it. Suddenly, a glimmer of worry started to creep into my consciousness. I was concerned about something. The fact that their buddy was incredibly intoxicated, in addition to the fact that it was the middle of the night, left them completely confused about where she was. In addition, they were in possession of her phone, which meant that they were unable to even call her in order to inquire about her location. Teresa Martin, Kanika's mother, should be approached as the next logical step, according to the conclusion that they reached via their investigation. After taking out their phone, one of the pals called the number that had been provided to them from the list of available numbers. When Teresa picked up the phone in the middle of the night, she was immediately overtaken with a feeling of dread. This feeling occurred very quickly. As a result of the physical distance that separated them, the voice of the friend of her daughter who was on the other end of the line sounded peculiar. The events that had taken place were described in detail by them. They informed her that they had just left the party that was held at the Crowne Plaza after they had left the party. Because Kanika was unable to find either her phone or her keys, they had left her in the lobby so that she could go look for them. This was done so that she could go and find them. After returning to the ground, they were unable to locate her anywhere in the area. Teresa was given the assurance that they had her phone and keys and that everything was probably fine, but they were unable to locate Kanika. Teresa was offered this assurance. Teresa's thoughts seemed to be racing at a quick pace. It was a straightforward inquiry that she addressed to them. Were any of you drinking any alcohol? A little lull occurred in the conversation that was taking place on the other end of the line. Both of the friends gave off the impression of being anxious and guarded. The situation was minimized by them, and they replied something along the lines of, "Oh no, maybe a drink or two." They continued to go on and on about how certain they were that Kanika was doing well for herself. However, when it came to Teresa, her instincts as a mother were screaming that something was horribly, extremely wrong. She was concerned about her daughter. Despite the fact that it was 3:30 in the morning, her daughter had not been seen for a considerable amount of time, and her friends were completely unaware of her disappearance. The fact that she would be arriving to the hotel on her own was something that she shared with them. At some point in the future, she was going to recover her children. Teresa Martin came at the Crowne Plaza Hotel at a time that was quite close to 5 o'clock in the morning. The sun had not yet risen at that precise instant in time. She entered the tranquil lobby with the idea of locating Kanika, and she did it with a single, unwavering goal in mind. The first thing that she did was to go right to the front desk, and this was the first thing that she did. An explanation of the issue was provided by her to the manager who was on duty at the time. She shared with him the news that her daughter, Kanika Jenkins, had been present at a party that was situated on the 9th degree. It was stated by her that her companions had discovered her in this very same lobby the last time they saw her, but that she had disappeared since that time. Although Teresa made an effort to keep her calm, it is clear that she is in a desperate state of mind because of the tone of her voice. However, despite the fact that I am certain that she is doing well, we are unable to find her. Due to the fact that her friends have access to her phone, I am unable to get in touch with her. Would it be feasible for you to take a brief look at the footage that was captured by your security cameras in order to figure out where she went? We are unable to determine if she has left the hotel, or whether she is still present somewhere within the establishment, or whether she has departed the hotel. Viewing the video footage is all that is required of us at this time. It appeared as though the request, which was made by a mother who was experiencing fear, was reasonable. The personnel at the hotel, on the other hand, was completely and utterly unyielding in their refusal. She was advised by the management that they were unable to share her with the footage that was captured by the protection system. His point was that it was against the policy of the hotel to show a film to a guest who had not yet filed an official report with the police regarding a missing person. He believed that this was a violation of the hotel's policy. In spite of the fact that this is a widely accepted rationale, it is not necessarily legally required in the majority of situations. It is possible for a hotel to collaborate with other establishments in the event of an emergency situation in order to provide assistance in the search for a person who may be in danger. But this management was inflexible in their approach. No support was offered by him in any way. It was explained to Teresa by him that in order for her to watch the movie, she would first have to go and file a complaint for a missing person. Teresa was taken aback by the news. She was feeling more and more afraid with each passing minute, and she was becoming increasingly agitated. At the same time that time was running out, those individuals who were in a position to provide assistance to her continued to maintain their obstinate unwillingness to do so. Teresa, who was under the notion that she had no other choice, left the lobby of the hotel and stood outside in the chilly early morning hours. She was under the impression that she had no other options. After removing her own phone from her pocket, she dialed the number for the police department. In addition, she offered an additional explanation on the entire incident. In spite of the fact that the hotel had surveillance footage that could reveal the location of her child's whereabouts, they refused to show it to her without first receiving a complaint from the authorities. A search for her daughter was conducted at the motel. She repeatedly pleaded with the dispatcher to send an officer to this location in order to persuade them to show us the movie. Despite the fact that the officers were eager to listen to her, it seemed as though they did not share her sense of urgency over the matter. She requested, "Can you please send an officer down here?" When viewed from their perspective, it seemed as though this was a situation that occurred rather regularly. A young person who was 19 years old was present at the party that was being held. Overindulging in alcohol was her habit. She left on her own accord. Every single time it happens to be the case. Teresa was advised that her daughter was most likely with other friends and that it was possible that she had returned to a separate room in the hotel in order to get some rest. Teresa was also informed that it was possible that her daughter took a nap. They advised her to exercise patience and wait for a couple of hours before making any decisions. Be sure to check and see if Kanika is present. It is possible that she will call them once again in the event that she has not yet arrived by that time. Teresa was now feeling a double dosage of frustration as a result of the situation. In the beginning, there was the hotel, and now there are the police. Nobody took her seriously. She was not being taken seriously. At first glance, it seemed as though no one could possibly comprehend the terror that she was going through. During the time that the sun was just about to rise, her daughter had been absent for a substantial amount of time. She came to the conclusion that she would go out and look for Kanika on her own in the case that no one else was ready to help her search for her. In no way was she going to do nothing but wait around. There was no way that she would do that. At the same time as she was making her way back into the hotel, her determination got greater. Following her ascent into an elevator, she made her way to the 9th floor, which was the location of the party that had been hosted earlier. Initially, she started pounding on doors at one end of the hallway, and then she worked her way to the opposite end of the hallway. From door to door, she knocked on each and every one of them. She went door to door. In the event that she received a response, she would question as to whether or not the individual had seen her daughter Kendall. She would query as to whether or not she was there in their chamber by describing her through the use of her description. There was a significant amount of time that she spent walking around the floors of that hotel. As she made her way from the 9th level to the 8th floor, and then from the 8th floor to the 7th floor, she not only questioned every person she saw, but also knocked on every door she encountered. She was a single mother who was on a mission. She was frantic and frightened about the situation. Despite this, she was not making any headway at all. It was impossible to find Kanika anywhere. This continued to take place all throughout the morning and into the afternoon, even after it had already begun. After Kanika had been seen for the remaining time, the administration of the hotel eventually found out where Teresa was located at roughly 1:15 inches the afternoon. This was nearly 10 hours after Kanika had been seen for the last time. They came to the realization that she was actively searching for her daughter by going from one residence to another in an effort to find her. In addition, rather than offering to help her, they went ahead and reported her to the authorities. They not only filed a report of trespassing against her, but they also issued an order that she be removed from the residential property. In light of this, law enforcement officers arrived at the Crown Plaza for the second time on that particular day. Nevertheless, they were present this time in order to deal with Teresa during this particular instance. As soon as she encountered the law enforcement officers, she was presented with a fresh opportunity. It was with great urgency that she approached them and pleaded with them to reconsider their decision. My daughter has not been seen or heard from since 10 hours ago. I have not been able to locate her. I myself am in possession of it. We are currently in possession of her keys. My attempts to get in touch with her have been unsuccessful. It would be really appreciated if you could request that the hotel give you a copy of the surveillance film. After being approached by a mother who was obviously not going to give up, the police officers complied with the request this time around. Teresa accompanied the officers as they made their way to the front desk, where they gave the manager the information that they needed access to the CCTV film. After receiving their request, the staff at the hotel showed them the footage that they had requested. On the other hand, the only cameras that were shown to them were those that were situated in close proximity to the principal entrances of the hotel. The film was evaluated by both the law enforcement officers and the security personnel working at the hotel. It was during the late hours of the previous night that they were able to see Kanika making her way into the hotel with her friends. In spite of this, they never once saw her leave the area when they were going over the hours of tape. According to the information that we have, it does not appear that Kanika has left through any of the principal entrances. It seemed as though this was abundantly plenty for both the law enforcement and the motel establishment. After that, they switched their focus to Teresa and were on the verge of saying, well, there you have it. She is still present in a particular area of the hotel. They were under the impression that their task was complete. After seeing the movie that was shown to them, they were able to formulate a straightforward response to the question. There is no attempt made to seek information regarding the existence of additional cameras. Could you please confirm whether or not there is surveillance equipment installed in the basement, the service areas, and the corridors? The investigation had been completed at this point in time due to its conclusion. Following that, they conveyed to Teresa the news that they were no longer able to contribute to her assistance. Furthermore, due to the fact that the hotel had filed a complaint, she was no longer allowed to remain on the grounds with the goal of conducting a search. She was left with no other option but to leave, and the result was that her heart was broken in the process. Her hunt for answers was fruitless, and at this time she was unable to even look for her child on her own. She was at a loss for explanations. Teresa and her family were unable to see through the haze that was the remaining hours of the day, and they were filled with the most terrible suffering. It was impossible for them to assist. It was quite difficult for them to find Kanika within that hotel, despite the fact that she was most certainly located somewhere within the establishment. The initial idea that she had simply drifted out with friends or gone to another room grew less and less plausible with each passing hour. This was because she had been out for a longer period of time. Due to the fact that she had been absent for a considerable amount of time, this was the result. Both her phone and her keys were out of her possession. Her lack of communication with anyone was a problem. Despite the fact that her mother had spent a number of hours doing a comprehensive search of the public floors of the hotel, she had not been successful in locating her daughter. The passage of time itself was the one little detail that destroyed the idea, and it was the one thing that utterly demolished the core drunk teenager will turn up theory. Extremely long periods of time had already elapsed. Something was wrong with the circumstance. A nagging feeling that had started in the middle of the night had now turned into a full-blown certainty for her family that Kanika was in extremely precarious circumstances. This realization came about as a result of all that had happened. Late that night, after what seemed like an eternity, someone or something shifted. 10 o'clock is the hour of the night. The Rosemont Police Department made the decision to go to the hotel and review the security footage once more on Saturday, 17 hours after Kanika had vanished without a trace. When they examined the material this time, they did it with a greater degree of caution. A number of factors may have contributed to this decision, including the realization that this was not a typical incident of a missing individual or the pressure that was exerted by the family. In this particular instance, they did not only look at the cameras that were covering the exits, they also looked at other cameras. They started looking through film from a number of different areas within the hotel where Kanika was staying in an effort to piece together a timeline of the activities that Kanika was known to have participated in before moving on. That was the period when they were successful in locating her. Through the use of a webcam feed that was recorded in the early hours of the morning, they were able to observe Kanika. The timestamp on the video indicated that it was 3:20 inches the morning immediately after her friends had left her in the lobby. This occurred just a short while after they had abandoned her. While Kanika was wandering about the motel, it was clear from the footage that she was completely by herself. There is little doubt that she was experiencing a severe case of disorientation. After exiting the main lobby area, she went in the direction of a staircase that led down rather than moving towards the exit or back to the guest elevators. She ultimately chose to take the stairway. The stairway was followed by her until she reached the bottom of the stairs. After making her way down the steps, she found herself in a part of the hotel that was not designed for use by guests. She might be found in a service corridor that was situated on the basement level of the main building. It was observed that she was walking along a lengthy corridor that was completely devoid of any individuals at any point over the course of the video. It was impossible for her to stand for an extended period of time. While she was lurching forward, she was making an effort to stabilize herself by crashing against the wall whenever she moved forward when she was moving forward. It appeared as though she was confused and disoriented. Immediately after that, the camera caught her as she rounded a corner and entered a large kitchen that was constructed out of stainless steel. This kitchen was not used at all throughout the time that it was being restored. To put it another way, it was essentially abandoned to the point that it was practically abandoned. In the course of her journey around the empty kitchen, she came across ovens and counters that were not being utilized by anyone. It was at that very moment that she stepped away from the camera's line of sight, which was situated at the opposite end of the kitchen. When the shot was taken, she was no longer showing up. The authorities maintained their monitoring efforts, employing a number of different camera angles in their investigations. In contrast, she was never captured on any other camera again after that point in time. Following the time when she left the kitchen, there was no more sighting of her. Now that they had a specific location from which to carry out their duties, the authorities were completely aware of the tasks that they needed to complete. Following their departure from the security office, they dashed straight down to the basement of the hotel, where they remained until they were no longer in danger. The exact halls that Kanika had gone through a few hours earlier were traversed by them as they made their way through the same vacant corridors. After entering the kitchen, there was a complete lack of any noise whatsoever. At this point, they began their search. The clock was ticking down to 1 o'clock in the morning, and it was still far beyond midnight. It was precisely the morning of Sunday. It had been close to 24 hours since Kanika's friends had last seen her. This meant that some of them had not seen her in quite some time. In addition, the unfortunate finale of the search for Kanika Jenkins took place in the kitchen where she was being detained. The police officers saw a massive freezer that was accessible to the general population. It was possible for them to open the enormous passageway. In addition to that, they found Kanika hidden away. Her existence had come to an end. As a result of the study, the events that took place during the perplexing minutes that she was dying were pieced together. After she had parted ways with her friends, Kanika, who was in a state of acute intoxication, had drifted off into the distance. After making her way down, she entered the kitchen of the hotel's basement, which was absolutely devoid of any presence. A walk-in freezer of considerable size and of commercial quality had been left on and unlocked for reasons that we may never be able to fully comprehend. The freezer had been left on. There was a door that was open. Kanika, who was probably looking for a spot to relax or rest because she was lost, entered the entryway. She must have been looking for a location to do so. The heavy door, which was constructed to close tightly and was insulated, swung shut behind her once she had left the room. Due to the fact that the door had already been shut, it would have been incredibly challenging, if not impossible, for someone in her position to open the door from the inside. Despite the fact that the majority of current refrigerators come equipped with an integrated safety release mechanism, it is extremely plausible that Kenika was unable to locate it or even realize what was happening place. Her death was brought on by hypothermia, which was brought on by the fact that she was confined inside the icy environment. Kenika's death was determined to have been the consequence of an accident, according to the official verdict of the medical examiner. Alcohol and topiramate, a medication that is taken for epilepsy and migraines, were discovered as significant contributory factors when it was concluded that hypothermia was the cause of death. Hypothermia was also recognized as the cause of death. From the perspective of her family and a sizable portion of the broader public, however, the narrative was not as straightforward as it may have appeared. The announcement of her passing and the unusual circumstances that accompanied it aroused an anger of unparalleled proportions. Irreverent circumstances surrounded her passing. The information that was brought to light regarding the hotel, as well as the initial response that the police department provided to the matter, shocked and outraged the general population significantly. Internet sleuths and concerned individuals began investigating every piece of evidence that was available, and when the conspiracy theories involving the alleged foul play were initially published, they began to spread like wildfire throughout the internet. In the eyes of the general public, the concept that a young woman could accidentally find herself confined inside a freezer in a major hotel was just incomprehensible. Nevertheless, in spite of all the rumors and speculation, the investigators could not discover any evidence to suggest that anyone else was contributing to her passing after they conducted their investigation. The most significant and puzzling question that has not yet been answered, on the other hand, has nothing to do with a conspiracy. Time is the major concern in this scenario. On the day when Teresa, Kenika's mother, arrived at that motel, it had been just 2 hours since Kenika had vanished without a trace. Earlier, she had urged with the employees to have a look at the surveillance cameras. When she was in a difficult situation, she had pleaded with them to help her. They were not in agreement. The police, upon receiving her call, did not take her worries into consideration and instead asked her to wait for additional instructions. On the other hand, what if they had looked at it? What would have happened if, at 5 or 6 in the morning, when Teresa was the first person to raise the alarm, the workers at the hotel had simply gone through all of the footage? As a result of their presence, they would have seen Kenika making her way into the basement by accident. They might have found her in the kitchen, which was a possibility considering the circumstances. A maximum of a couple of hours would have been the maximum amount of time that she would have spent in the freezer prior to that crucial period. Not only is it conceivable that she would have been alive all along, but it is also a chance that she would have been alive if she had in fact been alive. Tragically, not only is it a tragedy that Kenika Jenkins lost away, but it is also a tragedy that she could have been prevented from passing away to such a big degree. There was a window of opportunity when a rescue could have been performed. Nevertheless, that window of opportunity was allowed to close. The string of failures, which included the hotel's refusal to comply and the police's initial lack of urgency, were the reasons why there was a window of chance. Almost immediately after the occurrence, Teresa Martin filed a lawsuit against the Crowne Plaza Hotel, the security company that was employed by the hotel, and the restaurant that was leasing the cooking space. Many millions of dollars were the subject of the complaint that was filed. It was alleged in the complaint that they were careless in the sense that they did not adequately lock a potentially hazardous place, which was the walk-in freezer. In addition, it was asserted that the fact that they did not respond promptly to her requests for assistance was a direct factor in the passing of her daughter. Following a protracted legal struggle, the matter was ultimately settled out of court for a sum that was estimated to be greater than $6 million. Despite this, there is no amount of money that will ever bring Kanika back or erase the dreadful what-ifs that will continue to afflict her family. Neither one of these items is feasible at this time. They are left with the disheartening reality that the system that was intended to protect individuals failed their daughter at every single point of the process. They discovered that they were in this predicament without knowledge. In the final, eerie film, Kanika can be seen wandering through the hotel's chilly and deserted hallways by herself. This footage serves as a heartbreaking final tribute to a life that was cut too short. In addition to this, it serves as a sobering reminder of how a series of decisions made by bureaucrats that appear to be of little significance can result in the most disastrous of outcomes. I want to express my gratitude for your presence here today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would appreciate it if you could share your ideas with me in the comments area. Also, bear in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime waiting for you to watch in one sitting right now. You may watch all of these episodes in one sitting. Till the next time we meet again, what's going on?